What if everything you learned in history class was a well-polished lie? Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate myth, fed to generations like apple pie and manifest destiny. From wooden teeth to freedom fries, from cherry trees to Cold War fairy tales, these are the stories America tells itself to sleep at night. But tonight, we're staying up. Welcome to 99. Absolutely wrong U.S. history facts that you still believe. A 2-hour descent into the beautifully broken, accidentally hilarious, and deliberately misleading mess we call American history. Buckle up. Your textbooks are about to betray you. George Washington had wooden teeth. If George Washington had wooden teeth, he was either a dental pioneer or the world's most committed beaver impersonator. Spoiler, he was neither. America's first president, the guy so stoic he looks like he's enduring a colonoscopy on the dollar bill, actually had dentures made of ivory, gold, human teeth, and lead, which sounds more like a cursed alchemist's starter pack than anything medically sound. The myth of his wooden teeth probably came from the way the ivory stained and cracked over time. Kind of like your aunt's antique coffee table, or a Civil War reenactor's dignity. It didn't help that Washington was painfully self-conscious about his mouth. He had them fitted and refitted to the point that his face shape changed, which explains why he always looks like he's simultaneously smirking and suffering. So no, he wasn't gnawing cherry bark like a patriotic lumberjack. His mouth was more a taxidermy experiment than a lumberyard, which is probably why he wasn't much of a public speaker. It's hard to yell "Liberty" when your teeth are clicking like castanets. And speaking of yelling things in the name of liberty, guess who didn't gallop alone shouting "The British are coming"? Paul Revere rode alone, shouting "The British are coming." Picture it. One man, one horse, one knight. Lanterns swing, hooves thunder, and Paul Revere bellows the immortal words, "The British are coming," except he didn't. That entire cinematic sequence belongs in a 1950s Hollywood fever dream and not in any actual revolutionary reality. First of all, Revere wasn't alone. He was part of a relay team. Yes, like a colonial Uber Eats squad for panic. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott were out there too, shouting less iconic things like, "The regulars are out," which doesn't quite slap the same on a bumper sticker. Why so vague? Because most colonists still thought of themselves as British, so shouting, "The British are coming," would be like warning Americans that Americans are arriving. And he wasn't galloping through the night like a one-man Broadway number. He was trying not to get caught. This was espionage, not karaoke. Revere actually got detained by British troops during the ride. The real hero who made it all the way to Concord? Prescott. But history doesn't do backup singers. So the next time someone tells you to ride like Paul Revere, remember, he didn't finish the ride, he didn't say the line, and he definitely wasn't alone. Now, if you think that's patriotic fiction, wait till you hear who allegedly designed the American flag. Betsy Ross designed the first American flag. Betsy Ross, the woman, the myth, the patriotic Etsy shop prototype. Her name is stitched, quite literally, into every elementary school play about American history. Ask a fifth grader who designed the first flag, and you'll get an enthusiastic Betsy Ross right before they glue a star to their forehead. But here's the truth. There's absolutely no historical evidence that she did any of it. The tale didn't even surface until almost 100 years after the Revolution, when her grandson, who, conveniently, had a lot of time and ambition, told the story to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. His main sources? Family lore and vibes. No documentation, no sketches, no invoice for 13-star fabric. Nothing. But hey, why let truth get in the way of a good quilting narrative? Congress did approve a flag design in 1777, but there's no official mention of Ross. She was a real person and did sew flags for the Pennsylvania Navy. But the "I sewed the first flag for General Washington himself" line That's about as historically supported as Abraham Lincoln fighting vampires. So while Betsy Ross remains sewn into the mythos of Americana, she's not the woman behind the stripes and stars. But if you think that's the only romanticized relationship in early American history, oh boy, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' relationship was loving and consensual. Thomas Jefferson, author of Liberty, owner of People. The contradiction practically writes itself. Among the most unsettling legends Americans still cling to is the idea that Jefferson and Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman he legally owned, had a consensual, even romantic relationship. It's the historical equivalent of describing kidnapping as an unplanned relocation. Let's be crystal clear. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's property. She was 14 when she was brought to France, where their relationship likely began. Jefferson was 44. 14. In today's terms, we would call that what it is, statutory rape and exploitation. But in the warm, sepia-toned haze of American myth-making, we're encouraged to believe in a complicated romance. There is no complicated way to say slavery erased consent. Hemings had no legal personhood, no agency, no option to say no. If love exists in that context, it's because we've deluded ourselves into thinking power doesn't corrupt intimacy. Jefferson freed some of her children he almost certainly fathered, but never freed her, not even on his deathbed. So the next time someone says their relationship was mutual, remind them that consent doesn't come with chains. And speaking of oversimplified legends, let's look at another tale Americans swallowed whole. Lincoln, an envelope, and 4 immortal paragraphs. Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope. Yes, the image. Abraham Lincoln, that stovepipe-hatted savant, hunched over a scrap of paper on a speeding train, scratching out the Gettysburg Address between bites of hardtack and existential dread. It's adorable. It's cinematic. It's also not true. The idea that Lincoln jotted down one of the most famous speeches in American history on the back of an envelope is a myth so durable, it's basically patriotic furniture. In reality, Lincoln carefully prepared his speech. Multiple drafts survive, and none of them are scrawled on anything even resembling stationery from the Pony Express. In fact, he was famously meticulous about language. The Gettysburg Address is only about 270 words, but it took thought, edits, and intentional phrasing. Lincoln knew he was speaking on hallowed ground, and he didn't leave that to improvisation. The whole back of the envelope thing probably stems from a collective American addiction to genius as miracle worker stories. We like our brilliance accidental and our presidents humble. So while Lincoln may have been modest, his speech wasn't a last-minute doodle. It was a rhetorical scalpel, cutting straight through the nation's grief. And speaking of American icons we love to credit for things they didn't exactly do, let's talk about Mickey Mouse. Walt Disney drew Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse, global mascot, merchandising juggernaut, and the only rodent that could file a cease and desist. But let's clear something up. Walt Disney did not draw Mickey Mouse. He did not hunch over a drafting board dreaming up circular ears and cheerful capitalist joy. That honor goes to Ub Iwerks, Disney's unsung creative engine and the guy who probably needed a wrist brace by the time Mickey hit his third pose. Walt was the voice of Mickey, yes, and he definitely owned the idea in every legal and financial sense that mattered. But the drawing? The actual animation? That was Ub. The man was a machine. He animated the first Mickey cartoon, Steamboat Willie, almost single-handedly, working so fast it looked like a Pixar server farm had possessed a human. But history likes its geniuses solo. Teamwork doesn't test well in myths. So Walt got the credit, Ub got the wrist cramps, and Mickey got a global empire. And speaking of mis-sized myths with towering reputations, how about we travel back to a French general whose height was never the real shortcoming? Napoleon was short. Napoleon Bonaparte, the tiny tyrant, the compact conqueror, the original short king. Except he wasn't short. This myth has stuck to him like a stubborn lint ball on a black coat, and we can mostly thank British propaganda and sloppy conversions between imperial and metric measurements for that one. In reality, Napoleon was about 5 feet 7 inches in modern terms, decidedly average for a Frenchman of the 18th century. Not tall, not short, just aggressively normal. But thanks to British cartoons portraying him as a furious manlet stomping around Europe like a teacup poodle with a cannon, the Napoleon complex became a pop psychology staple. Which is hilarious, considering that the guy spent more time engineering massive military campaigns than overcompensating with a jacked-up horse. The French used a different measuring system, and when translated to English feet, his recorded height sounded unusually small. Add that to centuries of national pettiness and some truly imaginative editorial cartoons, and voila. We turned a competent, if increasingly unhinged general into the butt of every height joke. So no, Napoleon didn't launch a war because someone made fun of his heels. But speaking of costumes that never existed, let's talk horned helmets and Norse drama. Vikings wore horned helmets. If your mental image of a Viking looks like a linebacker from Minnesota with horns sprouting from his helmet like a devil-themed salad bowl, congratulations, you've been lied to by centuries of opera, Halloween costumes, and really bad historical television. Vikings, the actual Norse marauders of the 8th to 11th centuries, didn't wear horned helmets. Not in battle, not on raids, not even at interpretive dance night down at the Mead Hall. This myth came to life in the 19th century when costumers and romantic painters got a little carried away, trying to give Viking warriors that extra theatrical flair. Wagnerian opera, horns, nationalist art movements in Scandinavia, horns. Your uncle's bad tattoo? Horns. But archaeological finds? Absolutely no horns. Why? Because putting horns on a helmet is a great way to get them stuck in someone or something, which sounds cool until you're dead, because your hat made you top-heavy. Actual Viking helmets were practical, dome-shaped iron or leather, sometimes with nose guards, but never horned, unless you count cattle rustling. So the next time you see a Viking cosplayer looking like a demonic moose, just nod and smile. Now let's pivot from fantasy invaders to one of America's most problematic fairy tales. Columbus and his discovery. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Ah yes, Columbus. The man credited with discovering a land that was already fully inhabited, developed, and being actively lived on by millions. That's not a discovery. That's trespassing with better PR. Let's start with the obvious. When Columbus landed in 1492, he didn't even hit the continental United States. He stumbled into the Caribbean, thought he was in Asia, and immediately began enslaving and brutalizing the indigenous people he found there. To be clear, they were doing just fine without him. The land was not new. It was just new to Europeans with bad maps and worse intentions. Also worth noting, the Vikings had already made it to North America centuries earlier. Leif Erikson and crew showed up in what's now Newfoundland, built a few huts, and then wisely left. But they don't get a national holiday. Probably because they didn't bring back gold, slaves, or elaborate geopolitical headaches. Columbus didn't discover America. He inaugurated centuries of genocide and colonial exploitation under the cheerful banner of exploration. But hey, he did prove one thing. Marketing beats morality almost every time. And speaking of dates, Americans love to get wrong. Let's talk about that sacred firecracker holiday. July 4th. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. Cue the fireworks, crank the Sousa marches, and bite into something red, white, and vaguely cholesterol-laced. It's July 4th, the birthday of America. Or is it? Because if you're picturing all the Founding Fathers dramatically signing the Declaration of Independence on a sunny afternoon like it's some sort of colonial summer camp guestbook, you're about a month off. Sure, the Declaration was adopted on July 4th, 1776, but most of the signers didn't put pen to parchment until August 2nd. Why the delay? Bureaucracy, politics, and the general chaos of creating a nation from scratch. Drafts had to be copied, members had to be present, and someone had to iron their ruffled shirt. It wasn't a movie moment. It was a logistical headache with feather pens. That means the big, iconic signing, the scene they show in every high school documentary with solemn faces and dramatic music, didn't happen on Independence Day. July 4th was more like hitting publish on a blog post than dropping the mic on tyranny. But we love a clean narrative and an even cleaner date to slap on party decorations. So we just sort of agreed to believe the myth instead. And while we're myth-busting colonial cheer, let's talk about those supposedly freedom-loving pilgrims. Pilgrims came to America seeking religious freedom for all. The Pilgrims. Brave souls fleeing persecution, crossing the ocean in a floating shoebox, landing on a rock, and establishing the sacred principle of religious freedom. For absolutely no one but themselves. It's a nice story. The Pilgrims left England to escape religious oppression. Which is true. Their religion was being suppressed. But the moment they got some elbow room in the New World, they set up shop and started policing belief like medieval mall cops. You want freedom to worship? Sure, as long as you're worshiping like them. Otherwise, you could expect to be fined, flogged, exiled, or just dead. This wasn't a pluralistic utopia. The early Puritan colonies had the energy of a very judgmental HOA meeting with gallows. Dissenters like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams were promptly booted for thinking differently. The Pilgrims weren't building a spiritual democracy. They were building a theocracy with extra corn. So while it's technically correct to say they came for religious freedom, it's just as correct to say they brought their intolerance with them and repackaged it in homespun wool. And speaking of intolerance wrapped in American folklore, let's pay a visit to Salem, where witches burned. Or did they? The Salem witch trials involved witches being burned at the stake. Burned at the stake. It sounds so dramatic, so sinister, so deliciously witchy. Fire, brimstone, and pointy hats. Except in Salem, that's not what happened. No one was burned. Not a single witch went up in colonial flames. The preferred execution method in Massachusetts was hanging, which is, let's be honest, still horrifying, but slightly less cinematic. 19 people were hanged during the 1692 hysteria, and one unfortunate man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones because he refused to enter a plea. That's right. He was slowly crushed into silence while demanding more weight. Brutal and metal. But not burned. The idea that American witches were burned likely comes from conflating the Salem trials with European witch hunts, where burning was more popular, especially on the continent where they really knew how to throw a bonfire. But in New England, the Puritans stuck to good old-fashioned rope and wood for structure, not for flame. So the next time someone tells you the Salem witches were torched like s'mores, remind them, the truth is darker, colder, and no less horrifying. Now let's flap over to another bird-brained legend about the national symbol that almost wasn't. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey as the national bird. Benjamin Franklin, inventor, diplomat, suspected electricity fetishist, and alleged turkey enthusiast? According to the myth, Old Ben lobbied hard to crown the turkey as America's national bird instead of the bald eagle, painting the noble gobbler as a symbol of true patriotism and moral virtue. Just imagine, instead of soaring eagles on our coins and emblems, we'd have angry, overgrown chickens with neck wattles. But here's what actually happened. Franklin never seriously proposed the turkey as a national bird. What he did do was write a snarky letter to his daughter, complaining that the eagle was of bad moral character and a bit of a lazy coward who stole food from other birds. He compared it unfavorably to the turkey, which he called a much more respectable bird. respectable. He wasn't drafting legislation. He was roasting the eagle like a turkey. In peak Ben Franklin sarcasm, Franklin's real issue wasn't ornithological. It was symbolic. He thought the eagle was a poor representation of American virtue. The turkey, stubborn, native, and weird, seemed more fitting for a scrappy new republic. But no, there was no vote, no campaign, no turkey inauguration. And speaking of things that aren't quite what they seem, let's talk about that pure democracy Americans love to brag about. America is a pure democracy. If America were a pure democracy, voting would be like ordering from a diner menu. You pick, and the kitchen delivers. But in reality, it's more like whispering your order to a middleman who may or may not hear you, and then tells the chef what they think you really wanted. Welcome to the Republic, folks. The U.S. isn't a pure democracy. Never was. It's a representative democracy. More specifically, a constitutional republic. The Founding Fathers didn't trust the masses all that much. They designed layers upon layers of filters, buffers, and committees to keep direct rule by the people at bay. Think of it as democracy, but with a parental lock. This is why we have the Electoral College, a Senate that gives Wyoming the same number of votes as California, and a lifetime appointed Supreme Court that can overrule majority opinion. It's democracy with a but attached to every sentence. So when politicians wax poetic about the will of the people, remember, the people's will is often passed through a bureaucratic obstacle course made by powdered wig skeptics who feared mob rule more than monarchy. And if you think that sounds convoluted, wait until we unpack the Civil War and what it was really about. The U.S. Civil War was solely about states' rights. The states' rights defense, history's favorite smokescreen. The Civil War, we're told, wasn't about slavery. It was about states having the freedom to govern themselves. Like a teenager yelling, "You can't tell me what to do," while holding a match over a gasoline can labeled human bondage. Here's the blunt version. The rights Southern states were fighting for was the right to own people. Slavery wasn't a side issue. It was the issue. Confederate leaders made that crystal clear in their own words. The declarations of secession mention slavery more often than a barbecue mentions sauce. Mississippi's secession declaration literally opens with, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." Subtle, right? Sure, states' rights were discussed, but they were used to defend and preserve slavery. It's like saying the Titanic sank because of maritime challenges. Technically true, but conveniently missing the iceberg. This myth persists because it's more comfortable than admitting the country tore itself apart over the ownership of human beings. It's easier to say liberty than chains. But speaking of liberty and wide open spaces, let's saddle up and meet a group of Americans Hollywood conveniently whitewashed. Cowboys. Cowboys were predominantly white. Cue the tumbleweeds and harmonicas. In the great American myth machine, cowboys are always white. Sun-scorched Marlboro men with a southern drawl, a six-shooter, and a silent moral code. The kind of guys who squint meaningfully and never explain themselves. But in actual history, the Wild West looked a lot more like a multicultural mosaic than a John Wayne casting call. Historians estimate that up to a quarter of all cowboys were black. Many were formerly enslaved people who took their freedom and went west, where cattle didn't care about skin color. Add in large numbers of Mexican vaqueros, who, by the way, invented much of what we now think of as cowboy culture, and Native Americans navigating a post-colonial nightmare. And you've got a cattle-driving crew that looked more like America than most of its monuments. So why do we picture a sea of white men with dirty hats and rugged stubble? Because Hollywood, the Western genre, scrubbed the diversity right out of the frontier, replacing it with a sanitized mythology of lone rangers and honorable sheriffs. So the next time you hear a whip crack and see a man in spurs, just remember, chances are, history gave him a different shade. And speaking of things with extraterrestrial levels of misrepresentation, let's revisit Roswell. Roswell, New Mexico, was the site of an alien spacecraft crash. Roswell. the shimmering jewel in America's tinfoil crown. In 1947, something crashed on a ranch near this unassuming desert town, and ever since, it's been the Woodstock of alien conspiracies. Spaceships, autopsies, government cover-ups, and of course, an ever-growing industry of alien keychains and plastic UFO snow globes. But the truth? Deep sigh. The object that crashed was no flying saucer. It was a top-secret high-altitude balloon from Project Mogul, a classified government operation using radar reflectors and instruments to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Not exactly little green men, unless you count Pentagon accountants. The initial confusion was real. Local military issued a press release about recovering a flying disc, only to backtrack days later and say it was just a weather balloon. Too late. Once the words flying disc hit the press, the alien narrative took on a life of its own. Especially once the government acted all cagey about the whole thing. And thus, a legend was born. What crashed in Roswell wasn't a spaceship. It was Cold War paranoia with a splash of bureaucratic incompetence. But while we're correcting origin stories, let's travel back to the dawn of the automobile, where Henry Ford gets way too much credit. Henry Ford invented the automobile. Henry Ford, industrial genius, master of mass production, and, according to school textbooks, the guy who invented the car. Which is about as accurate as saying Steve Jobs invented electricity because he made the iPhone. Ford didn't invent the automobile. He made it unavoidable. The actual inventor of the first true automobile was Carl Benz, a German engineer who built a gasoline-powered car in the 1880s. You know the Benz in Mercedes-Benz? That guy. Meanwhile, Ford was still a twinkle in capitalism's eye. What Ford did invent, or rather revolutionize, was the assembly line system for manufacturing affordable cars. His Model T wasn't the first car, but it was the first car the average American could actually own without selling a kidney. Ford took what others had built, simplified it, sped it up, and slapped a price tag on it that middle-class families could handle. That's innovation, sure, but it's not invention. It's industrial evolution with better marketing. So the next time someone calls Ford the father of the automobile, remember, he was more like the guy who franchised the idea and turned the horse into an endangered commuter option. And speaking of founders and fictional stories, let's chop down the next myth. Washington and his famous cherry tree. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie, said young George Washington, bravely confessing to his father that he had whacked down a cherry tree with a hatchet. A tale so wholesome, it sounds like it was ghost-written by a Hallmark card. Except it never happened. Not even a little bit. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, Washington's early biographer and full-time myth factory. Weems was less interested in facts and more in turning Washington into a moral superhero, an American messiah for a new republic desperate for icons. The cherry tree anecdote was basically 18th century PR. It wasn't about truth, it was about branding. Ironically, the tale about George telling the truth was itself a complete fabrication, a lie about honesty. How's that for poetic fraudulence? There's no evidence that any cherry trees were harmed, no diary entries, no witnesses, and not a single surviving orchard lawsuit. But the story stuck, because Americans love a good moral parable, especially one that fits nicely into a school book margin and teaches children that integrity is more important than arboriculture. So yes, Washington had dentures, but no, he didn't need to gnaw his way through a cherry tree to prove his virtue. Speaking of underground myths, let's go beneath the White House. There's a secret tunnel system under the White House. Picture this: a sprawling labyrinth of secret tunnels snaking beneath the White House. Escape hatches, shadowy corridors, hidden bunkers where presidents vanish to plot world domination or avoid press conferences. Sounds cool, right? Like James Bond meets HGTV. But reality, as usual, is a lot more mundane. Yes, the White House does have underground structures, secure bunkers, utility tunnels, a few passages built during wartime. But it's hardly the Batman-level secret lair people imagine. No miles of tunnels stretching to secret exits under the Capitol. No pneumatic tubes carrying classified coffee orders. No conspiracy-fueled maze connecting to Area 51 or Elvis's bunker. Most of these ideas come from a mix of Cold War paranoia, spy fiction, and internet comment sections with zero engineering experience. The truth? The secret tunnel system is less about mystery and more about practicality. Moving people, equipment, and, during emergencies, presidents who'd rather not get vaporized. So while there is a basement and there are a few off-the-record spaces, it's not Narnia down there. It's just reinforced concrete, some seriously boring security details, and probably a lot of stale air. But if you're wondering where else reality fails to meet the fantasy, try the happiest place on Earth, where even the mice aren't what they seem. Disney World and Disneyland are completely rodent-free. You've paid $147 to sweat through synthetic magic in a place where dreams allegedly come true. Everything is spotless, meticulously themed, and even the trash bins sing. Surely, in this corporate utopia, there are no real rodents. Just one giant talking mouse and his overly cheery friends, right? Wrong. While Disney World and Disneyland may be masters of illusion, they're not above the laws of nature. They exist outdoors. In Florida and California, rodents? Yeah, they're there. Just not wearing gloves and suspenders. Despite Disney's famously obsessive cleanliness and their literal army of pest control professionals working behind the scenes, you simply can't have acres of manicured landscaping, food carts every 20 feet, and nightly fireworks without attracting real, live wildlife. Rats, mice, squirrels. They all want in on that popcorn and churro action. Disney just handles it really well. The rodents are managed, not exterminated into non-existence. It's like a highly choreographed detente between Mickey and his less glamorous cousins. Out of sight, mostly out of mind. So yes, the Magic Kingdom has its share of uninvited guests, but they're not on the payroll. Now let's leave Main Street and drift skyward to a myth that's truly out of this world. The Great Wall of China from space. The Great Wall of China is visible from space. The Great Wall of China, so massive, so ancient, so undeniably iconic that we collectively decided it had to be visible from space. Because why not? If it's not on Google Earth with a cosmic zoom out, what's the point of 13,000 miles of stone? Except here's the kicker. It's not really visible from space. At least, not with the naked eye. Astronauts have said it blends into the natural terrain like a very persistent scar. And unless the lighting and conditions are just right, it's virtually impossible to spot. Meanwhile, you can see things like highways, airports, and even big cities from low Earth orbit. So, the wall loses that visibility contest to a Costco parking lot. The myth likely gained traction because we love poetic exaggeration. It's so big you can see it from space. Sounds way better than, it's long, but sort of camouflage colored. The Great Wall deserves awe. But let's stop giving it superpowers it doesn't actually have. So no, it won't show up in your intergalactic sightseeing tour. Now let's swing from ancient walls to modern warfare. Specifically, one that America thought would be a Cold War slam dunk. Enter Vietnam. The U.S. fought the Vietnam War to stop the spread of communism globally. Vietnam. The war America marched into with confident speeches, jungle fatigues, and a firm belief that it was about saving the world from communism. The idea was simple. Domino theory. If Vietnam fell, the whole world would topple like a red flag Jenga tower. So we sent troops, and money, and helicopters, and napalm. Lots of napalm. But the full truth? The war wasn't just about stopping communism. It was also about colonial fallout, nationalism, pride, and Cold War paranoia so thick you could bottle it and sell it as political cologne. The Vietnamese weren't Soviet puppets. They were nationalists fighting for independence after decades of French colonial rule. To them, America wasn't liberating anyone. It was just the next foreign occupier with a flag and an attitude. The problem wasn't just the cause, it was the clarity. The goalposts moved constantly. We weren't winning hearts and minds. We were just adding bodies and headlines. And in the end, a costly, traumatizing withdrawal that left more questions than answers. So yes, anti-communism was part of it. But if that's all you think the war was about, you're missing the tangled mess of context, consequence, and chaos. Now, speaking of tangled conspiracy theories, let's launch ourselves straight into the moon landing. The U.S. moon landing was faked, July 20th, 1969. Humanity takes its first awkward, dusty steps on the moon. Or, if you believe a surprising number of internet theorists and your cousin Chad, it was actually filmed on a soundstage in Burbank, using a shaky cam and some impressive tinfoil budget. Let's get this out of the way. The moon landing was real. The evidence is overwhelming. We've got moon rocks, telemetry data, third-party confirmations, and oh yeah, radio signals tracked by countries that had no reason to lie, including Cold War rivals. But the myth persists because we love a juicy conspiracy, especially one that makes us feel smarter than the sheeple. The theory really took off in the 70s, right when public trust in government was tanking faster than a lunar rover in a crater. Add in grainy footage, a lack of stars in the sky, because exposure settings exist, and the always irresistible idea that Stanley Kubrick may have directed it, and boom, instant paranoid legend. But let's be honest, if the government really was this good at faking things, DMV lines wouldn't exist. So no, we didn't fake the moon landing. But speaking of fake academic failures, let's talk about Einstein's report card. Albert Einstein failed math in school. Albert Einstein. Poster child for misunderstood genius, gravity-defying hair, and the universal symbol for I suck at math, but look at what he became. Every underachieving student clings to the myth that Einstein failed math in school as a sacred excuse to avoid their own homework. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for mathematics, this is pure nonsense. Einstein didn't fail math. In fact, he was ahead of the curve from an early age. He mastered calculus before most kids figured out how to tie their shoes and was publishing papers while others were still doodling on their desks. The confusion likely stems from a misreading of his grades, which were reported on a scale that flipped later in time. So a 1 meant excellent, not poor. Add a little translation error, some wishful thinking, and boom, eternal myth. The real truth? Einstein was not a struggling math student. He was just a nonconformist in a very rigid education system. He didn't fail math. He failed to care about dumb rules, which, let's be honest, is far more impressive. So yes, dream big, but don't cite fake failures to justify procrastination. And speaking of political traditions that aren't as timeless as we pretend, let's talk presidential term limits. U.S. presidents have always served 4-year terms. When you think of a U.S. presidency, you picture that tidy, predictable rhythm. 4 years, maybe 8 if things go well, and then a quiet retreat into Netflix and legacy management. But while the 4-year term has always existed, the idea that presidents have always been limited to 2 terms, that's a post-World War II invention. For most of U.S. history, there was no constitutional limit on how many terms a president could serve. The 2-term tradition started with George Washington, who, ever the dramatic exit strategist, stepped down voluntarily after 2 terms, setting a gentlemanly precedent. Most presidents followed suit, until Franklin D. Roosevelt showed up. FDR said, "Why stop at 2?" and went ahead and got elected 4 times. In fairness, the country was dealing with the Great Depression and a world war, minor inconveniences that made continuity look pretty appealing. Still, this broke the long-standing informal rule, And after FDR's death, Congress decided to slap a hard limit on the Oval Office party. The 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951. So no, term limits weren't always a thing. They were added later, like a safety lock after someone left the engine running for too long. Now, speaking of things that America definitely uses more than we admit, let's measure out the truth about the metric system. The U.S. only uses the metric system for science. The United States and the metric system have the kind of relationship you'd expect from two exes who still awkwardly bump into each other at mutual friends' barbecues. The myth goes, Americans don't use the metric system except in science, which sounds neat and compartmentalized, until you realize it's not remotely true. While it's true that everyday Americans cling to feet, inches, gallons, and Fahrenheit like heirlooms from a nostalgic nightmare, the metric system is quietly everywhere. Medicine, dosed in milligrams, soda bottles, measured in liters. Track and field, 100 meters, not 328 feet. Global trade, metric. Engineering, manufacturing, military operations, metric, metric, metric. It's not that America avoids the metric system, it just refuses to admit it. Like a guy secretly binge-watching reality TV while insisting he only watches documentaries. Meanwhile, school children are taught both systems, but by adulthood, everyone pretends the metric one never existed. Until they go to the doctor or buy a bottle of imported shampoo. So no, the metric system isn't hiding in some dusty science lab. It's been here the whole time, just dressed in a lab coat so Americans wouldn't freak out. And speaking of commercial myths dressed in false identities, let's talk about the real story behind Black Friday. Black Friday is named after the stock market crash. Ah, Black Friday. That annual consumerist gladiator match where people trample each other for the last flat-screen TV like it's a limited edition holy relic. For years, people believed the term Black Friday originated from the infamous stock market crash of 1929. You know, the one that sparked the Great Depression. Economic doom, breadlines, despair. What better way to name a shopping holiday, right? Except, nope, totally unrelated. The real origin of Black Friday is rooted not in Wall Street, but in the gritty streets of 1950s Philadelphia, where police officers used the term to describe the chaos that unfolded the day after Thanksgiving. Imagine hordes of suburban shoppers flooding the city, clogging streets, boosting shoplifting incidents, and making traffic control an absolute nightmare. It wasn't a day of celebration. It was a tactical disaster. Retailers didn't love the negative connotation, obviously, so they pulled a little PR sleight of hand and rebranded it. Suddenly, Black Friday was the magical day when stores moved into the black on their ledgers, turning a profit. A feel-good fiscal fairy tale. So no, Black Friday isn't rooted in economic catastrophe. It's rooted in crowd control and retail spin. Now let's take a trip to the battlefield, where Custer's infamous last stand wasn't exactly the heroic blaze of glory you were told. Custer's last stand was a heroic final charge. In the American mythos, General George Armstrong Custer is a tragic hero, charging bravely into a hopeless battle, noble to the end, a martyr for manifest destiny. Cue the brass music, wave the flag, and pour one out for the golden-haired soldier who gave it all at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But let's rewind the reel and drop the slow-motion lens flare. What actually happened was less cinematic and more catastrophic. Custer's so-called last stand was the result of arrogance, poor reconnaissance, and a reckless underestimation of Native American resistance. He split his forces, ignored warnings, and led his men straight into an overwhelming force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, who were, understandably, not thrilled about being pushed off their land. It wasn't a charge, it was a disaster. Custer and his 200-plus men were wiped out in short order, and while he was later lionized as a fallen hero, the reality is messier. The U.S. military turned his defeat into propaganda to justify further campaigns against native tribes. So no, Custer didn't go down in a blaze of glory. He walked into a battle he didn't understand and paid the price. And speaking of misunderstood bargains, let's unpack the real cost of Alaska. The U.S. bought Alaska for pennies an acre. The Alaska Purchase. The ultimate thrift store find. The myth goes that the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia in 1867 for literal pennies per acre, snickering all the way to the gold rush. A masterstroke of geopolitical coupon clipping. But before you nominate Secretary of State William Seward for Extreme Bargain Hunters Hall of Fame, let's look closer. Yes, the U.S. paid $7.2 million for Alaska, which breaks down to about 2 cents an acre. But that figure ignores context. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $125 million today. A serious investment in a landmass no one at the time could figure out what to do with. It was mocked as Seward's Folly and Walrussia, a frozen, barren expanse filled with fur, ice, and buyer's remorse. It wasn't until gold and oil were discovered decades later that Americans suddenly declared it a steal. That's hindsight economics. Praise the deal only after it pays off. And let's be honest, if Alaska had remained a windswept tundra of moose and loneliness, we'd still be calling it a bad purchase. But if you think Thanksgiving is uniquely American, you're in for a surprise, because the harvest table's a lot more crowded than we've been told. Americans are the only ones who celebrate Thanksgiving. If there's one thing Americans love more than eating too much and arguing with their relatives, it's believing that no one else on earth would ever think to give thanks while eating too much and arguing with their relatives. Enter the myth. Thanksgiving is a uniquely American tradition, completely singular in its turkey-stuffed glory, which is adorable and wrong. While the U.S. version of Thanksgiving, with its pilgrims, parades, and overcooked stuffing, is certainly a national institution, the concept of giving thanks with a communal feast isn't remotely exclusive. Canadians celebrate Thanksgiving too, albeit a month earlier, with less football and more maple syrup. And plenty of cultures around the world hold harvest festivals that predate Plymouth Rock by centuries. Japan has Labor Thanksgiving Day. Germany has Erntedankfest. And indigenous peoples across the Americas had their own rituals of gratitude and a harvest celebration long before any buckle-shoed Englishman showed up. The myth of American Thanksgiving's uniqueness comes from a charming blend of cultural narcissism and grade school pageantry. It's not about being the only ones giving thanks. It's about pretending we invented the concept. So while the U.S. version is distinctive, the urge to gather, eat, and be grateful is universal. Now, speaking of universals we like to pretend don't apply to us, let's talk about America's military record. The U.S. never lost a war. If you ask the average flag-waving uncle at a barbecue, the U.S. has never lost a war. Ever. Maybe a few draws, maybe a couple of strategic withdrawals, but a loss? Not possible. We're America. We win things, especially wars. Except, no. The record isn't exactly spotless. Vietnam, not a win. It ended in chaotic withdrawal, political embarrassment, and the iconic image of helicopters evacuating the U.S. Embassy. Afghanistan, 20 years, billions of dollars, and it ended with the Taliban reclaiming control faster than anyone could locate Kabul on a map. The War of 1812? Let's just say Washington, D.C. got burned down and call it even. The never-lost myth survives because of selective memory and an obsession with narrative control. We rebrand losses as learning experiences and exit disasters as transitions. History gets edited into a highlight reel where defeats are either erased or passed off as someone else's problem. So yes, the U.S. has lost wars. It just prefers to deny them with patriotic amnesia and fireworks. And speaking of explosive misunderstandings, let's revisit a sailor who didn't sail off the edge of the earth because he already knew it was round. Christopher Columbus proved the earth was round. Here's a fun classroom classic. Christopher Columbus, brave explorer and intellectual rebel, sails west to prove the Earth is round, while the rest of Europe clings to the belief in a flat planet. What a genius! What a pioneer! What a pile of nonsense! By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, educated Europeans already knew the Earth was round. Ancient Greeks had figured that out 2,000 years earlier. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with a stick and some shadows. No need for a caravel. The real debate in Columbus's time wasn't whether the Earth was round. It was how big it was. Spoiler. Columbus thought it was much smaller than it is. He wasn't proving anything. He was rolling the dice with bad math. He assumed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic, not realizing there was a whole pair of continents in his way. Had the Americas not been there to catch him, his crew might have ended up as saltwater statistics. So no, Columbus didn't shock the world with his radical geography. He got lucky. Then he got lost. Then he got mythologized. And speaking of symbols we've misunderstood, let's hoist a very famous flag. Wrongly. The "Don't Tread on Me" flag was a universally adopted symbol of the Revolution. The Gadsden flag. Bright yellow, snake-coiled, hissing with coiled aggression and a passive-aggressive tagline. Don't tread on me. Today, you'll find it flying from truck beds, bumper stickers, and political rallies with all the subtlety of a middle finger in textile form. It's become a kind of shorthand for rugged independence, revolutionary spirit, and let's be honest, a touch of performative chest-thumping. But here's the twist. It wasn't the universal flag of the American Revolution. Not even close. The Gadsden flag was primarily associated with the Continental Marines and saw only limited use. It was one of many flags waving in the revolutionary wind. There were pine tree flags, rattlesnake variations, striped ensigns, and even some that looked suspiciously like British naval flags, just slightly more passive-aggressive. The idea that the Gadsden flag united all revolutionaries is more of a retroactive branding effort than historical reality. Like most things American, we streamlined a messy, decentralized moment into a single, iconic image and called it unity. So no, it wasn't the revolution's universal banner. It was just one snake in a very chaotic pit. And speaking of national myths with conveniently selective memory, let's tiptoe into the murky waters of religion and government. America was founded on Christian principles. Cue the stained glass montages and the earnest recitations of "In God We Trust." Many Americans are firmly convinced that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, blessed and baptized at birth in divine guidance. But if the Founding Fathers were trying to start a Christian theocracy, they sure hit it well. The U.S. Constitution contains exactly 0 mentions of God or Christianity. What it does include is a very deliberate separation of church and state. The First Amendment? Yeah, that whole "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion" bit wasn't a typo. Most of the founders were influenced more by Enlightenment rationalism than by the New Testament. Sure, many were privately religious, but collectively, they built a secular republic. Even Thomas Jefferson, who owned a copy of the Quran and literally cut the miracles out of his Bible, was crystal clear. Religion was personal, not governmental. The Treaty of Tripoli, ratified by the Senate and signed by President John Adams, explicitly states that the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. So no, America wasn't founded on Christian principles. It was founded on the principle of keeping religion out of politics. And speaking of historical rewrites dressed as feel-good holiday specials, let's carve up the first Thanksgiving myth. The first Thanksgiving was a harmonious meal between Pilgrims and Native Americans. If you've ever watched a school play where kids in construction paper hats pass around cardboard turkeys to smiling Native Americans, you've seen the Disney-fied version of the first Thanksgiving. It's a comforting story. Peace, sharing, and pie. But the real history? Not so sweet. Yes, there was a harvest feast in 1621 between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. But it wasn't some pre-planned diplomatic potluck. The Wampanoag weren't invited. They showed up armed, possibly in response to gunfire they mistook for a battle. The resulting 3-day gathering was more a momentary alliance of mutual necessity than a kumbaya moment. The Pilgrims were starving and dying. The Wampanoag were trying to navigate an increasingly unstable world as more colonists arrived. The harmony didn't last. Within decades, relations devolved into land theft, broken treaties, and violent conflict, including King Philip's War, one of the bloodiest per capita conflicts in American history. The sanitized Thanksgiving tale erases this messy aftermath, turning a brief strategic truce into a foundational fable of unity. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about survival, suspicion, and temporary coexistence. And if you think this is the only embroidered story involving patriotic stitching, let's revisit Betsy Ross again. Betsy Ross sewed the first flag in 1776. Ah yes, Betsy Ross, America's founding seamstress. According to legend, she sat demurely in her Philadelphia upholstery shop in 1776, was visited by George Washington and a few well-dressed revolutionaries, and then promptly whipped up the first American flag, like it was a Pinterest project with revolutionary flair. Stars? Check. Stripes? Check. Dramatic flair? Double check. There's just one problem. There's absolutely no solid evidence this happened. The tale didn't even surface until nearly a century later, in 1870, when Ross's grandson, William Canby, told the story to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. His source? Family lore, no documents, no letters, no receipts for 13-star fabric, just a great yarn and a desire to stitch Grandma into the fabric of national mythology. Convenient, isn't it? What we do know is that Congress adopted a flag design in 1777, but there's no record naming Ross as the seamstress. She did make flags, just not necessarily that one, and certainly not under presidential direction before the flag was even an official thing. So while Betsy Ross deserves recognition for her craftsmanship, crediting her with the first flag is more wishful embroidery than historical fact. Now let's ride underground with a myth that's somehow more literal and still wildly misunderstood. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an actual railroad. The term Underground Railroad sounds so wonderfully literal, doesn't it? Like Harriet Tubman was secretly conducting trains through subterranean tunnels while dodging lantern-wielding slave catchers and maintaining a strict schedule. The myth paints an image of an actual railway system beneath the soil of antebellum America, complete with steam, tracks, and heroic engineers. But let's apply some reality here. There were no tunnels, no trains, no rail cars of freedom. The Underground Railroad was a metaphor, a secret network of people, routes, safe houses, and code words used to help enslaved individuals escape to free states in Canada. The terminology came from railroad lingo. Conductors guided escapees, stations were safe houses, and cargo was heartbreakingly the human beings risking everything for freedom. The operation was decentralized, illegal, and dangerous for everyone involved. It relied on secrecy, trust, and an extraordinary amount of bravery, not iron tracks. Believing it was an actual railroad might make the story sound cooler, but it also sanitizes the real human risk and ingenuity involved. The Underground Railroad wasn't an industrial marvel. It was a grassroots act of resistance. And now that we've derailed that myth, let's tip our hats to another staple of the American West, the allegedly oversized cowboy hat. Cowboys always wore 10-gallon hats. Nothing says Wild West like a cowboy with a 10-gallon hat. Towering, iconic, comically large. It's the first thing people reach for when dressing up as a rootin' gunslinger. But here's the thing. The 10-gallon hat is one of the most misinterpreted pieces of fashion lore in American history. It wasn't a hat big enough to hold 10 gallons of water. It wasn't even standard cowboy issue. The term 10-gallon is believed to have come from a linguistic mix-up. Spanish vaqueros, the original cowboys, often wore hats with braided hat bands called galons. Somewhere along the way, gallon got misheard, mangled, and inflated into gallon. Because why wouldn't Americans convert a measurement error into a fashion statement? Actual cowboy hats varied greatly. They were practical, regionally adapted, and designed for shade, not spectacle. Broad brims, sure, but they weren't trying to store beverages on their heads. The exaggerated hats we associate with cowboys today are mostly the invention of Hollywood costumers who never met a stereotype they couldn't double in size. So no, cowboys weren't loping across the prairie wearing oversized sombreros of doom. And speaking of American myths in need of a rebrand, let's look at that melting pot metaphor everyone loves to stir. America is a melting pot, where everyone assimilates. Ah, the melting pot. The warm and fuzzy metaphor that paints America as one big stew. Toss in some cultures, turn up the heat, and out comes a rich, flavorful national identity. Everyone's different, but somehow the same. It's a comforting idea, like believing your microwave burrito is gourmet because it contains more than one ingredient. But in reality, America's more like a buffet with some very tense seating arrangements. Sure, people arrive from all over the world, but the pressure to melt often means sacrificing cultural identity to fit a narrow mainstream mold, usually white, English-speaking, and Protestant adjacent. It's less melting and more conforming. In truth, a better metaphor might be a salad bowl or a mosaic, or even an aggressively disorganized flea market. Immigrants don't all dissolve into one homogeneous soup. Many communities retain distinct languages, traditions, and values while still participating in American society. And often, assimilation isn't a gentle process. It's enforced through laws, discrimination, and economic pressure. So no, the melting pot isn't a utopian crock-pot of unity. It's a myth that glosses over cultural erasure and systemic inequality with a big, cheesy smile. Speaking of misattributed inventions, let's dive into that internet origin story we keep wrongly sticking on a certain politician. The internet was created by Al Gore. Let's clear the air once and for all. Al Gore did not invent the internet. He didn't tinker with servers in a garage. He didn't design TCP/IP in his basement. And he wasn't struck by lightning while holding an Ethernet cable. Yet somehow, the myth that he claimed to have created the internet persists like a spam email from 1998. Here's what actually happened. During a 1999 interview, Gore said he took the initiative in creating the internet. Which sounds clunky, yes. But he was referring to his role in funding and promoting the internet's development as a congressman and later as vice president. He championed infrastructure bills, invested in research networks, and helped move the whole thing from a government tool to the backbone of modern life. In short, no Gore, no easy web surfing. But that's not the same as physically inventing it. Still, the quote got yanked out of context, turned into a punchline, and now lives forever as digital folklore. Because nothing sticks in American culture like a nerdy politician being accused of overreaching. So while Gore helped grow the internet, he didn't invent it. Now let's talk about another myth involving American documents and public display cases. This time, the Declaration of Independence. The U.S. Declaration of Independence is stored in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. for all to see. Cue the Nicolas Cage references. The Declaration of Independence, we're told, is proudly and permanently displayed in the National Archives, glowing under protective glass, just waiting to be admired, or, dramatically stolen. But the full truth is less like a Hollywood heist and more like a security protocol manual written by a librarian with anxiety. Yes, the Declaration is housed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but it's not always just sitting there in plain view like a historical screensaver. It spends most of its life in a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled, bomb-proof vault, designed to withstand everything from environmental decay to, presumably, rogue treasure hunters. Even when it's on display, what you're seeing isn't the crisp, inspiring scroll of school textbooks. It's a faded, almost illegible document that's been through war, neglect, bad storage, and the unforgiving passage of time. The visible part. That's more ceremonial than educational. So yes, the Declaration is there, but it's not your average museum exhibit. It's fragile, it's protected, and it's not something you can just roll up and tuck under your arm for a quick escape. Speaking of things people still believe we're frozen in time, let's finally thaw out that myth about Walt Disney. Walt Disney froze himself after he died. This one really puts the fantasy in the wonderful world of Disney. Somewhere in the collective imagination, Walt Disney didn't just build a kingdom for dreams. He also became his own science fiction subplot by freezing his body in cryogenic stasis, waiting patiently beneath Disneyland for a future that could cure death and reboot his empire. Sounds cool, literally, but it's not remotely true. Walt Disney was cremated. Ashes, Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. No liquid nitrogen, no secret Disney dungeon, no icy sleeping chamber hidden under the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. The rumor of his frozen immortality began shortly after his death in 1966, fueled by a combination of secrecy around his funeral, public fascination with cryonics, and the human tendency to turn beloved moguls into eternal legends. Ironically, Disney never expressed public interest in cryogenics, and the science at the time was barely beyond speculative science fiction. Yet the myth stuck, because the idea of Walt sleeping under the Magic Kingdom, like some capitalist King Arthur waiting to return in America's hour of need, it's just too narratively delicious to give up. But while Disney's body isn't on ice, some historical innovations get frozen in time. Like that glowing little invention we still wrongly assign to a guy named Edison. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Ask a room full of people who invented the light bulb, and someone will chirp Edison, like they're answering the easiest question on Family Feud. The man's name is practically synonymous with electricity. But in reality, Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He perfected it, and marketed it, and patented it with the ruthless precision of a man who could electrify a city and sue you in the same breath. The concept of electric light predated Edison by decades. Inventors like Humphrey Davy and Joseph Swan were already experimenting with glowing filaments before Edison ever set foot near a laboratory. Swan even received a British patent for his own version. But Edison made it work, longer lasting, commercially viable, and mass producible. And then he did what Edison did best. He claimed the spotlight and buried the competition under a mountain of paperwork and incandescent charm. So no, he didn't invent the light bulb. He improved the recipe, opened the first chain restaurant, and slapped his name on the sign. And speaking of names slapped onto false perfection, let's revisit that other George Washington myth. The one that claims he had a divine allergy to falsehoods. George Washington never told a lie. George Washington, father of his country, first president, and apparently the only man in American history to reach adulthood without fibbing. Ever. At least, that's what the cherry tree fable would have you believe. I cannot tell a lie, he supposedly said, when confessing to an act of arboreal vandalism. Adorable, inspiring, and entirely made up. Like the cherry tree story itself, the idea that Washington never told a lie was invented by Mason Locke Weems, America's earliest and possibly most creative biographer. Weems wasn't interested in documenting Washington's flaws. He wanted a mythic founding father, honest, virtuous, and practically glowing with moral infallibility. So he created a child-sized moral lesson dressed in powdered wigs and good intentions. The real Washington, human, capable of deception when necessary, especially in war, where disinformation was often key to victory. He ran spy rings. He used fake intelligence. He absolutely lied, strategically and perhaps even skillfully. So while I Cannot Tell a Lie is a sweet bedtime story, the truth is far more useful. Even icons of integrity sometimes bend the truth to serve the greater mission. And speaking of bending, Let's stretch the truth a bit more as we revisit how America's legislative sausage really got made. The U.S. bicameral legislature was a compromise based on population alone. Here's a civic bedtime story. America's Congress, split between the House and the Senate, was designed as a tidy compromise between big states and small states over how many representatives each should get. Bigger states get more say, smaller states get a seat at the table, and everyone goes home happy. The implication? It was all about population. Pure math. Democracy's awkward group project. Except the real story is murkier, messier, and deeply rooted in power. Not just people. The Great Compromise of 1787, which created the House and the Senate, was about more than population. It was a balancing act between centralized federal power and state sovereignty. Large states wanted representation based on numbers, understandable. Small states, terrified of being steamrolled, demanded equal representation. But lurking underneath all this were debates about slavery, taxation, and political control. This wasn't just math. It was political trench warfare with powdered wigs and a lot of sweaty parchment. So no, the bicameral legislature wasn't built on population logic alone. It was an uneasy handshake between clashing visions of governance, geography, and ideology. And speaking of historical oversimplifications, let's ride back to that infamous midnight cry, and what Paul Revere didn't actually say. Paul Revere shouted, "The redcoats are coming." Imagine the drama. Paul Revere galloping through the night, a man on a mission yelling, "The redcoats are coming," into the colonial darkness like he's auditioning for a historical action movie. It's a line burned into American memory, etched into every elementary school skit and cartoon rendering of patriotic urgency. It's also entirely fictional. Paul Revere didn't shout, "The redcoats are coming," because, well, nearly everyone in Massachusetts was still British. Screaming that phrase would have been like warning your neighbors that the citizens are approaching. Not exactly helpful intel. More likely he said something like, "The regulars are out," referring to the British regular army forces. And while we're myth-busting, let's throw in the fact that Revere wasn't even alone on this ride. He was part of a whole midnight alert tag team, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, the latter of whom actually completed the full warning run. Revere got detained by British troops halfway through. So no dramatic shouting, no solo heroism, just a coordinated effort and a story that got the Hollywood treatment long before Hollywood even existed. And now, for another misinterpreted historical win. Let's settle the score on who actually came out ahead in the War of 1812. The U.S. won the War of 1812. The War of 1812. America's second bout with Britain and the sequel nobody asked for. If the Revolutionary War was the original blockbuster, this one was the clunky, awkward follow-up with fewer clear victories and a whole lot more confusion. Yet many Americans still claim it as a decisive win. Old Glory triumphant, national pride secured, and the British running for the hills. Except, that's not how it ended. The truth is, the war concluded in a draw. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814, restored pre-war boundaries and settled exactly none of the major issues that started the conflict. Impressment of American sailors? Not really resolved. Territorial disputes? Mostly just tabled. The biggest actual result was a massive rebuilding effort after the British burned Washington, D.C. to the ground, which doesn't exactly scream victory. Of course, Americans remember the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty was signed, and credit it with redeeming the war. But that's like scoring a touchdown after the game clock expires, and then demanding a trophy. So no, the U.S. didn't win the War of 1812. It survived it. And speaking of misunderstood battles, let's head south to the Alamo, where the legend and the reality parted ways long ago. The Alamo was purely about Texan independence. Remember the Alamo, a battle cry immortalized in Texas lore, shouted with chest-thumping pride by people who often have no idea what they're remembering. In the myth, the Alamo was a noble last stand, where freedom-loving pioneers died for the sacred cause of Texan independence. But the full truth is way more complicated and uncomfortable. Yes, the defenders of the Alamo were fighting for independence from Mexico. But what that independence meant had a lot to do with preserving slavery. At the time, Mexico had outlawed slavery, while many American settlers in Texas had brought enslaved people with them. The tension wasn't just cultural or linguistic, it was deeply economic, and slavery was at the heart of the conflict. The Texan rebellion wasn't solely about liberty. It was about who got to own other people and under which government's rules. The defenders of the Alamo weren't innocent victims. They were armed insurgents holed up in a Catholic mission, resisting a Mexican government they didn't want to obey, especially on matters of race and labor. The romantic retelling skips the footnotes and replaces nuance with muskets and martyrdom. And speaking of misunderstood beginnings, let's roll back the constitutional clock to the Mayflower and another document Americans misremember. The Mayflower Compact was the first written constitution in America. The Mayflower Compact, the sacred scroll of America's earliest settlers, a proto-constitution signed aboard a creaky boat in the middle of the ocean. It's often hailed as the first written constitution in America, as if the Founding Fathers took inspiration from a bunch of seasick Puritans holding quills over their knees. But here's the truth. The Mayflower Compact was not a constitution. It was a basic agreement, a temporary improvised social contract to keep everyone from descending into mutiny before they even built a roof. Signed in 1620, it simply pledged that the signers would form a civil body politic and obey laws for the general good. It had no structure, no branches of government, no real framework beyond, let's not kill each other before dinner. It's important, sure. It represents self-governance and collective responsibility. But it's about as much a constitution as a roommate agreement is a lease. The real constitutional groundwork came much later, from more complex colonial charters, and eventually, that little document we now keep in the National Archives next to security lasers. So no, the Mayflower Compact wasn't a full-blown constitution. It was more like a group text to keep the group project from falling apart. And speaking of things misremembered for good PR, let's dive into why the U.S. really entered World War II. The U.S. entered World War II to save Jews from the Holocaust. One of the most pervasive and comforting myths in American history is that the United States entered World War II to stop the Holocaust, to ride in on white tanks and liberate Europe from genocide. It's a noble idea, a righteous one. It's also flat-out false. The U.S. entered World War II because of Pearl Harbor. Period. Japan bombed Hawaii on December 7, 1941, and suddenly neutrality became unsustainable. Germany declared war shortly after. That was the catalyst. The Holocaust? At that point, it wasn't even widely known, and it certainly wasn't the reason Americans signed up to storm the beaches of Normandy. In fact, the U.S. response to Jewish refugees was tepid at best and downright hostile at worst. Visa quotas remained low, and ships carrying Jewish passengers were turned away. The American public and government was more concerned with fighting fascist expansion than rescuing targeted populations. Did the Allies liberate concentration camps? Yes, but that was a byproduct of military objectives, not the mission itself. So no, we didn't go to war to stop the Holocaust. We went to war because we were attacked. The truth is far less cinematic and much harder to swallow. Now let's gallop into another myth that's all dust, gunsmoke, and historical revisionism. The Wild West. The Wild West was a lawless free-for-all. In the mythic version of the American West, everything past the Mississippi was a violent playground ruled by mustached outlaws, whiskey-fueled shootouts, and sheriffs who enforced justice with a six-shooter and a one-liner. It's the lawless frontier, where civilization was just a suggestion, and every town had at least 3 saloons, 2 brothels, and one undertaker on speed dial. Except that version was written by dime novelists and screenwriters, not historians. The real Wild West was surprisingly orderly. Most frontier towns had functioning legal systems, community ordinances, and fewer violent crimes than you'd expect. Homicide rates in many of these towns were lower than in today's major cities. Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood weren't war zones. They were growing settlements full of shopkeepers, farmers, and folks trying to make a buck without getting shot in the face. Sure, there were saloons and the occasional duel, but the chaos has been wildly exaggerated by 20th century media. The frontier wasn't anarchy, it was bureaucracy in a cowboy hat. Towns quickly installed marshals, built jails, and enforced laws, because nobody likes living in constant fear of stagecoach bandits. So no, it wasn't Mad Max with tumbleweeds. It was more like a startup town with livestock. And now let's return to a myth that still gets Columbus Day parades, despite a resume that reads like a war crimes rap sheet. Christopher Columbus was a benevolent explorer. Every October, school kids in paper hats recite the charming saga of Christopher Columbus, benevolent explorer, brave navigator, an unlikely hero who discovered the New World. He's often painted as a kind-hearted man with a great sense of direction and a slight allergy to accurate maps. But if Columbus were around today, he'd have a legal team, a PR disaster, and several international tribunals on his calendar. Columbus wasn't a gentle trailblazer. He was the front man for imperial brutality. After landing in the Caribbean in 1492, he quickly set up a system of forced labor, violent subjugation, and brutal exploitation of the indigenous Taino people. Within decades, their population had been nearly wiped out, not just by disease, but by slavery, starvation, and systematic slaughter. Columbus didn't just discover a continent. He helped launch centuries of colonial genocide. He also never set foot in what is now the continental United States. So when people wave the American flag on Columbus Day, it's not just historically inaccurate, it's geographically off-target. The image of Columbus as a kindly adventurer is a myth built on national convenience and whitewashed textbooks. The real story is uglier, bloodier, and far less marketable. Next up, another liberation myth that doesn't quite free itself from oversimplification: the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves. Cue the dramatic reenactments and triumphant music. Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and poof, all slaves are freed, freedom reigns, and history marches toward justice. That's the version you probably heard in school. The truth? It's more complicated and much less magical. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people in Confederate states forever free. Sounds sweeping and definitive, until you realize Lincoln was only freeing people in territories he didn't control. The proclamation didn't apply to border states like Kentucky and Maryland, which still permitted slavery and remained loyal to the Union. It also didn't apply to areas of the Confederacy already under Union occupation. In other words, it was both a moral stand and a strategic move, intended to weaken the Confederacy, discourage foreign support for the South, and redefine the war as a fight against slavery. It didn't immediately free most enslaved people, and it relied on Union military success to become real in practice. The true abolition of slavery came 2 years later, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. So while the proclamation was monumental, it wasn't a magic wand. And speaking of national exceptionalism, let's burst the next myth about American constitutional exclusivity. America is the only country with a constitution. If patriotism had a tagline, it might as well be, America, the land of freedom, eagles, and the world's only constitution. According to a certain brand of national folklore, no other country had the foresight or founding genius to write down the rules. The U.S. Constitution is treated less like a document and more like a divine relic, part scripture, part Swiss Army knife, capable of solving all problems if you just squint hard enough. But let's snap out of the constitutional daydream. America is not the only country with a constitution, not even close. In fact, nearly every modern nation has one, written, codified, and legally binding. France, Constitution. Japan, Constitution. Brazil, Constitution. The list goes on. Some countries have rewritten theirs multiple times, while America clings to a document that's been patched like an old tire over the centuries. Yes, the U.S. Constitution is one of the oldest still in use. It's historically significant. It's influential. But it's not unique. Acting like the rest of the world is just winging it without rules is the legal equivalent of believing you invented breathing. So no, we're not the lone torchbearers of written government. And speaking of declarations we misunderstand, let's revisit the moment we broke up with Britain. Sort of. The Declaration of Independence declared the United States independent from Britain, July 4th, 1776. The day the colonies declared independence from Britain and instantly became the United States of America, complete with fireworks, bald eagles, and synchronized flag-waving. That's how it's told, at least. But in reality, the Declaration of Independence didn't make the U.S. independent. It just said it wanted to be. The document was a formal breakup letter, filled with poetic rage and philosophical grievances. It listed King George III's crimes like a colonial burn book and laid out a case for why the colonies were over it. But this wasn't legally binding for the British. To them, the colonies were still a bunch of rebels. Independence wasn't achieved through declaration. It was won through blood, mud, and a very long war. Actual recognition of American independence came 7 years later, in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris. That's when Britain finally admitted, okay, fine, you're your own country. Take your tea and leave. So while July 4th is symbolically important, it marks the intent, not the result, of independence. And speaking of intentions versus assumptions, let's unpack another myth about the Founding Fathers and just how united they really were. All Founding Fathers were wealthy landowners. When you picture the Founding Fathers, it's usually a room full of powdered-wigged aristocrats lounging in high-backed chairs, sipping port, and casually birthing a nation between bouts of property management. The assumption? They were all rich, land-owning elites with massive estates and pockets lined in silver. But while many were wealthy, hello George Washington and his Mount Vernon empire, not all the founders fit the monocle and mansion stereotype. Some came from modest backgrounds. A few were self-made. Many were lawyers, printers, merchants, or former tradesmen who climbed the ranks through education and political ambition. They were privileged by the standards of their day, yes. But not all were rolling in tobacco plantation money. Even among the elite, wealth varied. Alexander Hamilton, for example, was born out of wedlock in the Caribbean and had no land or inheritance. His rise was fueled by sheer intelligence, audacity, and the ability to write like a caffeinated thesaurus. The founders weren't one monolithic aristocracy. They were a mix of economic classes, interests, and egos. So while wealthy landowners is a convenient shorthand, it flattens a far more complex cast of characters. And on the topic of oversimplifications, let's stir the pot with a myth that tries to paint America as a clean fighter in dirty wars. The U.S. never used chemical weapons. There's this comforting belief that the United States, while occasionally messy in its foreign adventures, has always maintained a clean moral line when it comes to warfare, particularly with chemical weapons. It's a tidy narrative. We're the good guys, and good guys don't gas people. Except history, as usual, has a tendency to leak through the seams of that particular storyline. The U.S. has developed, stockpiled, and yes, in some cases, used chemical weapons. During World War I, American troops were equipped with gas masks not just for defense. Mustard gas and chlorine gas were part of the Allied arsenal. And while direct battlefield deployment by U.S. forces was limited, the existence and readiness of chemical stockpiles was never in doubt. Then there's World War II, where chemical weapons were not used in combat, mostly because of mutual fear of retaliation, not moral superiority. However, the U.S. stockpiled massive amounts and even had tragic accidents, like the Bari incident in Italy, where a German attack on an American ship secretly carrying mustard gas led to hundreds of unintended casualties. So no, the U.S. hasn't kept its hands entirely clean. It's just kept the worst of it classified or buried under bureaucracy. Now let's blast off into another patriotic simplification. The space race and its supposedly singular mission. The space race was entirely about beating the Soviets to the moon. If you ask the average American to summarize the space race, it goes something like this. Soviets launch Sputnik, Americans freak out. Kennedy gives a speech, NASA builds a rocket, and boom, U.S. flag on the moon. Mission accomplished. Democracy, 1. Communism, 0. But reducing the space race to a lunar finish line misses the point and the layers. Sure, the moon landing was a huge symbolic win, but the broader race was about much more than just beating the Soviets to a cratered rock. It was about technological supremacy, military dominance, national morale, and, let's be real, public relations. Rocket science wasn't just science. It was about missile development. Many of the key figures on both sides, like Wernher von Braun, had military ties. The innovations in rocketry were as much about carrying warheads as they were about reaching the stars. And while the moon was flashy, other milestones mattered too. Communications satellites, spacewalks, reconnaissance, weather forecasting, and all the little gadgets that trickled down into everyday life. Looking at you, memory foam. So no, it wasn't just about planting a flag on lunar soil. It was a chessboard spanning the stratosphere. Speaking of misunderstood symbols of capitalism, let's roll the dice on the origin story of Monopoly. Monopoly was created to teach the evils of capitalism. Monopoly. The board game that ends friendships, ruins family game night, and teaches you that grandma will absolutely bankrupt you for a hotel on Boardwalk. It's the ultimate celebration of ruthless capitalism, complete with overpriced properties, jail time, and that smug little tycoon in a top hat. But here's the twist. Monopoly was originally anti-capitalist. The game was invented in the early 1900s by Lizzie Magie, a feminist and political activist who called it the landlord's game. Her goal? To illustrate the dangers of land monopolies and unchecked wealth. The original game had 2 rule sets. One where everyone benefited when wealth was shared. Spoiler, no one wanted to play that version. And one where players hoarded properties and crushed their opponents under rent hikes, which, as you can guess, became the fan favorite. Decades later, Charles Darrow came along, repackaged the second version, and sold it to Parker Brothers as his own creation. The message was flipped. What began as a warning about inequality became a celebration of it. So the next time you land on someone's hotel-stuffed property and lose your last dollar, remember, the pain was the point. And now let's switch from property empires to powdered wigs. Specifically, one that didn't need a wig at all. George Washington wore a wig. When you picture George Washington, it's usually with a perfectly powdered white wig perched atop his stoic, cherry tree chopping head. It's become so iconic that it's practically a piece of presidential anatomy, like Lincoln's hat or Teddy Roosevelt's mustache. But here's the surprise. George Washington didn't wear a wig. That was all his real hair. Yes, the first president's famously frosted locks were his own, painstakingly styled and powdered into place. In the 18th century, powdered hair was a fashion statement, one that signaled status, cleanliness, and just the right amount of aristocratic flair. Washington, ever the style-conscious general, followed the trends. He grew his hair long, tied it back, and powdered it into that frosty halo we now mistake for a toupee. Why the confusion? Well, wigs were indeed popular among the colonial elite, especially in the British courts. But Washington was all about authenticity, except apparently when it came to hair color. His choice to rock natural hair may have even played into his image as a rugged, homegrown leader, not some powdered-up European aristocrat. So no, he didn't don a wig. He just committed to an 18th century hair routine, more intense than most modern influencers. Now let's talk money. Specifically, the myth we still believe about what's behind the US dollar. The US dollar is backed by gold. There's something charmingly outdated about the idea that every dollar in your wallet represents a shimmering chunk of gold in a Fort Knox vault. It feels secure, physical, old school. But that system, the gold standard, is long gone. The modern dollar is based on a far more magical, mysterious substance: collective belief. The US dollar hasn't been backed by gold since 1971, when President Nixon officially ended the convertibility of dollars into gold. Before that, you could, in theory, exchange paper money for a fixed amount of the shiny stuff. But those days are over. Today's dollar is a fiat currency, meaning it's not tied to any physical commodity. Its value comes from government decree and the fact that people agree to use it in exchange for goods and services. What keeps it going? A complex stew of trust in the U.S. government, economic policy, and global confidence. Gold may still be held in reserves, but it no longer props up the greenback like a monetary life raft. So next time someone grumbles about printing money and mutters something about gold-backed days, just remind them, this economy runs on vibes and spreadsheets. Speaking of changes snuck in during nervous times, let's unravel the Cold War-era tweak to the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance has always included, under God, say it with me, one nation under God. It's drilled into school children like the alphabet or the national anthem, leading many to assume those two divine words have always been part of the Pledge of Allegiance. But surprise, they were added less than a lifetime ago, and not for spiritual reasons, but geopolitical ones. The original pledge, written in 1892 by Socialist minister Francis Bellamy, made no mention of God. It simply stated, "One nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." That's it. Clean, secular, idealistic. So where did under God come from? Enter the 1950s, a decade of McCarthyism, Cold War panic, and a national obsession with not looking like the godless communists across the ocean. In 1954, under pressure from religious groups and Cold War politicians, Congress inserted under God into the pledge as a public rebuke of atheistic Soviet ideology. It wasn't about theology, it was about branding. So while many Americans today see under God as an eternal fixture, it's actually a mid-century rebrand meant to paint capitalism with a halo. Now let's follow the paper trail a bit further, right into another mistaken belief about what the Constitution actually guarantees. The U.S. Constitution grants the right to vote. You'd think the Constitution, the very document meant to spell out the blueprint for American democracy, would come right out and declare, "Hey you, yes you have the right to vote," but it doesn't. Nowhere in the original Constitution is there a blanket guarantee of voting rights. And that's not just an oversight, it was entirely intentional. The Founding Fathers, cautious and deeply mistrustful of mob rule, left voting up to the states. In 1787, that meant the power to vote was typically reserved for white male property owners. Everyone else, women, enslaved people, Native Americans, poor folks, were left out of the Democratic Party. The Constitution didn't grant voting rights. It set the structure through which voting could happen and left the gatekeeping to local governments. Over time, various amendments tried to patch that gaping hole. The 15th, no race-based exclusion. The 19th, women's suffrage. The 24th, no poll tax. And the 26th, voting age lowered to 18. But none of them declare a universal right to vote outright. Instead, they prohibit certain types of discrimination. So no, voting isn't an inherent, automatic constitutional right. It's a hard-won privilege with more fine print than most people realize. And speaking of misunderstood battles for liberty, let's talk about Gettysburg and what didn't end it. The Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War. Because the South ran out of ammunition, Gettysburg, the battle so mythologized it practically has its own soundtrack. It's been dubbed the turning point of the Civil War, the moment the Confederacy's fate was sealed. And sure, it was pivotal. But was it because the South ran out of ammunition? Not quite. That explanation is like blaming a hurricane on someone forgetting to close a window. The real reasons for the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg were far more strategic and systemic. General Robert E. Lee's army had been stretched thin, overconfident, and deep in enemy territory. His decision to launch the infamous Pickett's Charge, a full frontal assault on fortified Union positions, was a disaster of hubris, not logistics. The South didn't lose because their bullets ran out. They lost because their plans did. It was also part of a much broader shift. The Union had begun to solidify advantages in manpower, manufacturing, and supply lines. Gettysburg was symbolic, but not magically decisive. It didn't end the war. It didn't instantly cripple the Confederacy. It was a bloody, chaotic three-day mess that slowed Southern momentum and gave the Union a badly needed morale boost. So no, the South didn't just run out of ammo. They ran out of luck, leadership, and illusion. Now, let's meet the real face behind America's most famous uncle, who was never actually your uncle. Uncle Sam was a real person who supplied meat to the Army. Uncle Sam, that stern-faced, finger-pointing symbol of national duty and military recruitment. The man who wants you to join the fight, pay your taxes, or just generally behave. But was he based on a real person? Supposedly, yes. A New York meat packer named Samuel Wilson, who supplied rations to U.S. troops during the War of 1812 and stamped his crates with U.S. for United States. Soldiers jokingly said it stood for Uncle Sam. It's a tidy story. Too tidy. While Samuel Wilson was real and did indeed supply meat, the idea that he single-handedly inspired the entire Uncle Sam icon is a stretch. The name Uncle Sam had been floating around as a slang term for the federal government even before Wilson's story gained traction. And the iconic image, the top hat, the goatee, the tailored patriotism that came decades later, solidified by political cartoonist James Montgomery Flagg during World War I. So yes, there may be a grain of truth in the Samuel Wilson tale, but Uncle Sam, as we know him, is more mythological mascot than historical figure. A government brand built from folklore, politics, and a really aggressive recruitment poster. And speaking of misunderstood bargains, next up is another great deal that cost a lot more than we like to admit. The Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. bought the Louisiana Purchase from France for a steal. The Louisiana Purchase. That proud moment when America supposedly conned Napoleon out of half a continent for the price of a luxury condo. As the myth goes, Thomas Jefferson forked over a mere $15 million for 828,000 square miles of land, essentially buying the future of American expansion for pocket change and a firm handshake. It's painted as a historic bargain, a geopolitical Black Friday deal. But here's the thing. While it looks cheap in hindsight, it was anything but at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that $15 million in 1803 would be over $300 million today. And for a young republic still figuring out how to keep its lights on, and whose currency was still finding its legs, it was a serious financial commitment. Congress debated the deal not because they thought it was cheap, but because they weren't sure the Constitution even allowed the federal government to buy land like that. And let's not forget, Napoleon didn't hand it over out of generosity. France was broke, distracted by European wars, and desperate to fund its military. Also, France had lost interest in its American empire after the Haitian Revolution, which severely undercut its colonial ambitions. So no, it wasn't a steal. It was a complex, expensive, and somewhat accidental land grab. Now let's flash forward a century to a man whose paranoia lit up an era and burned a few reputations in the process. The McCarthy era really did root out many communist spies in the U.S. government. The McCarthy era is often remembered as America's bold crusade against Soviet infiltration, a time when Senator Joseph McCarthy fearlessly rooted out communist agents embedded in the U.S. government. Cue the dramatic music, the black and white footage, the accusatory finger pointed at every vaguely left-leaning bureaucrat. Except most of what McCarthy uncovered was smoke and mirrors, less espionage, more witch hunt. Sure, there were some real Soviet spies uncovered during the Cold War, the Rosenbergs, for example, but McCarthy had very little to do with exposing them. His tactics were more about spectacle than substance. He waved around lists of names that turned out to be vague, outdated, or just plain made up. He destroyed careers, lives, and reputations based on hearsay and innuendo. His hearings were theater masquerading as justice, and his methods were so egregious that even his own party eventually turned on him. The real intelligence community quietly did the heavy lifting behind the scenes, using surveillance, code breaking, and actual evidence, not televised paranoia. McCarthy's greatest talent was self-promotion, not spy detection. So no, the McCarthy era didn't clean house. It set fire to it. Speaking of gold rushes gone bust, let's head west to California, where fortunes were promised and dreams were mostly pawned. The California Gold Rush made everyone rich. The California Gold Rush of 1849. A glittering moment in American history where dreams flowed as freely as the streams prospectors panned. The myth? Anyone with a shovel, a lucky streak, and a beard could strike it rich. Instant millionaires, fortune in every riverbed, and prosperity baked into the western soil. The reality? For most, it was more like a muddy, blistered game of survival. A small handful of early arrivals did strike gold, literally. But as word spread and tens of thousands poured into California, the gold became harder to find, the competition fiercer, and the costs sky high. Supplies were overpriced, living conditions were abysmal, and prospectors often ended up poorer than when they started. The people who actually got rich? Merchants. The ones selling the shovels, tents, boots, and eggs at 10 times their worth. Levi Strauss made his fortune not by panning for gold, but by stitching pants that didn't fall apart after 3 days in the mud. Meanwhile, native populations were devastated, and environmental destruction kicked into high gear. Rivers were poisoned, hills were gutted, and boom towns quickly became ghost towns. So no, the gold rush didn't make everyone rich. It mostly made everyone tired. Next up, a Thanksgiving twist you probably didn't see coming, because it didn't happen in Plymouth. The first Thanksgiving was in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Ask anyone to describe the first Thanksgiving, and you'll likely hear about Plymouth Rock, pilgrims in funny hats, and Native Americans graciously bringing corn to a quaint colonial potluck. According to popular lore, Thanksgiving began in 1621 in Massachusetts, forever cementing New England as the birthplace of American gratitude. But surprise, Plymouth wasn't first. Long before the Mayflower docked, other Thanksgiving celebrations had already taken place in what would become the United States. Spanish explorers in what is now Florida held a massive Thanksgiving in St. Augustine in 1565, over half a century before the Pilgrims showed up. English settlers in Virginia held their own day of Thanksgiving in 1619, complete with a written order that it be celebrated annually. The 1621 feast in Plymouth may have been the most mythologized, but it wasn't the first. It wasn't even called Thanksgiving at the time. It was just a harvest celebration, a temporary pause in an otherwise tense and fragile alliance with the Wampanoag people. So while Massachusetts cornered the branding, it didn't invent the holiday. The first Thanksgiving was more of a historical popularity contest than an actual beginning. And speaking of branding versus biology, let's talk hair color and Hollywood myth-making with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was a natural blonde. Marilyn Monroe, the eternal blonde bombshell, the breathy-voiced icon of mid-century glamour. Her platinum locks are as iconic as her red lipstick and tragic legacy. The myth, she was born that way. A natural blonde, blessed from birth with sunlit strands and movie star destiny. Reality? She was a brunette. A very normal, very non-blonde brunette named Norma Jean Mortensen. Her transformation into Marilyn Monroe was a calculated reinvention, crafted by Hollywood's image machine. And central to that reinvention was the peroxide bottle. Bleaching her hair wasn't just a style choice, it was a full identity reset. Monroe leaned into the dumb blonde persona, weaponizing it as both armor and brand. The hair helped create an image of innocence, seduction, and vulnerability, all rolled into one. But behind the scenes, she was anything but dumb. She read voraciously, founded her own production company, and fought against the roles studios tried to trap her in. So no, the blonde was never natural. It was strategic. And while we're stripping away illusions, let's talk about another American icon that didn't get officially enshrined until much later than most people assume. The national anthem, the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, was always the anthem. You'd think the Star-Spangled Banner has been America's official anthem since cannonballs first flew over Fort McHenry. The lyrics are etched into patriotic pageantry, sung before every sporting event, and mangled nightly by pop stars attempting impossible key changes. It's the anthem, right? Not always. For over a century, the U.S. didn't have an official national anthem. The Star-Spangled Banner was one of several patriotic songs in rotation, alongside My Country, 'Tis of Thee, and Hail Columbia. Each had its moment in the national spotlight, depending on the occasion or the region. The Star-Spangled Banner gained popularity, especially during wartime, but it wasn't formally adopted until 1931. That's right, more than 150 years after the Revolutionary War, and over a century after Francis Scott Key scribbled the lyrics while watching bombs burst in air. Even then, the melody itself was borrowed, from a British drinking song no less. So the tune that now demands solemnity and hat removal began its life echoing through alehouses. So no, the anthem wasn't always the anthem. It was a latecomer to the official party. And next up is another foundational misunderstanding about whether the Bill of Rights was baked into the Constitution from the very beginning. The Bill of Rights was part of the original Constitution. It's easy to assume the Bill of Rights, the 10 constitutional commandments of American liberty, was included in the original Constitution like sprinkles on a cupcake. After all, what's a founding document without the right to free speech, a bearable number of soldiers in your house, and the ability to not self-incriminate at Thanksgiving dinner? But in truth, the original Constitution didn't include the Bill of Rights, not even a draft. When the Constitutional Convention wrapped up in 1787, the focus was on structuring the federal government, checks, balances, elections, and how many signatures it would take to get Rhode Island to stop sulking. The idea of explicitly listing individual rights? That was dismissed by some of the framers as unnecessary, and even dangerous. They feared that listing certain rights would imply others didn't exist. It was only after fierce debate and loud objections from anti-federalists worried about government overreach that the Bill of Rights was added. It wasn't ratified until 1791, 4 years after the Constitution was signed. So no, the Bill of Rights wasn't in the original package. It was more like a post-purchase add-on, demanded by people who didn't trust politicians to do the right thing without a few legally binding reminders. Now let's examine another phrase that Americans confuse with a constitutional promise: the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence guarantees life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It sounds like a legally binding promise, a warranty from America's founding fathers that you, dear citizen, are entitled to a good life and a decent shot at bliss. It's stitched into the American psyche, printed on coffee mugs, and invoked in every inspirational commencement speech. Surely that means it's enshrined in the law. Not quite. That poetic phrase comes from the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. And as moving as it is, it's not a legal guarantee. It's a philosophical flourish, a statement of ideals crafted by Thomas Jefferson, with a little help from John Locke's earlier musings about life, liberty, and property. The Declaration isn't a governing document. It's a break-up letter with Britain. Its famous words express what the revolutionaries believed people were entitled to, not what the new government was actually obligated to deliver. The Constitution, which came more than a decade later, is the one that carries legal force, and nowhere in it will you find a right to happiness, or even the pursuit of it. You get due process, equal protection, and freedom of speech. Happiness? That's on you. And speaking of idealistic myths versus messy historical truth, let's wade into the fog of the Cold War victory narrative. The U.S. won the Cold War solely through military might. Ask anyone who lived through the tail end of the Cold War why the U.S. came out on top, and you're bound to hear something like, because we had the bigger stick. It's a comforting tale. The Soviets collapsed because America outspent, outgunned, and outpostured them into oblivion. Reagan talked tough, we built missiles, they folded. End of story. Except the reality isn't so steroidal. While military spending played a role, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a multi-layered implosion. The U.S. didn't win in a traditional sense. It outlasted a system that was already rotting from within. The Soviet economy was dysfunctional. Political reform under Gorbachev backfired. Nationalist movements surged. Bureaucracy choked innovation. Their system crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. Meanwhile, America's victory also had a lot to do with diplomacy, soft power, economic influence, and cultural dominance. Blue jeans and Coca-Cola arguably did more damage than tanks. And let's not forget the immense internal cost, debt, proxy wars, and a military-industrial complex that never really powered down. So no, the Cold War wasn't won by missiles alone. It was a slow, grinding end to a system that failed more than we defeated it. Next up, a myth that America loves to believe about itself, its moral high ground on human rights. The U.S. has always been a champion of human rights globally. Ask almost any American and they'll tell you. The United States stands for freedom, liberty, and human rights around the globe. It's the moral backbone of international democracy, the shining city on a hill, the country that sends troops, aid, and UN speeches to protect the oppressed. It's a beautiful story. But like most beautiful stories, it leaves out all the blood on the floor. While the U.S. has sometimes supported human rights abroad, it has just as often turned a blind eye or actively undermined them when inconvenient. During the Cold War, the U.S. backed a number of authoritarian regimes simply because they weren't communist. Pinochet in Chile? Supported. The Shah in Iran? Armed and funded. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines? Cozy relationship. The same country that helped write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also ran CIA black sites and waterboarded detainees. Domestically, things weren't so shiny either. Segregation, forced sterilizations, Japanese internment camps, those weren't footnotes. They were policy. The U.S. has often defined human rights through a political lens, supporting them when it aligned with national interest and ignoring them when it didn't. So no, the U.S. hasn't always been a beacon of human rights. It's been a spotlight operator, turning the beam on and off at will. And speaking of misattributed credit, let's talk about the so-called king of rock and roll and who actually laid the groundwork. Elvis Presley invented rock and roll. Elvis Presley. Swiveling hips, gospel growl, and a voice that melted teenage brains by the thousands. He's hailed as the king of rock and roll, the man who invented a genre and reshaped American music forever. But while Elvis had the moves, the mic, and the money, he didn't invent rock and roll. He just happened to be the guy the cameras were finally willing to point at. The sound we now call rock and roll was born from a fusion of black musical traditions, blues, gospel, rhythm and blues. Long before Elvis ever set foot in a recording studio, artists like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Chuck Berry, Little Richard and Fats Domino were electrifying audiences with guitar riffs and stage presence that would put most stadium acts to shame. But in 1950s America, segregation extended to music charts. Black artists made the music. White audiences discovered it when someone white performed it. Elvis admired and was influenced by black musicians. He didn't steal the genre, but he benefited enormously from a system that marketed his sound as new, simply because it came in a paler package. So no, Elvis didn't invent rock and roll. He inherited the throne, but the kingdom was already built. Next, we're staying in the mailroom of misconceptions, where capital letters and postal policy get all mixed up. The U.S. only uses capital letters for state abbreviations because of the Postal Service. If you've ever written CA or TX on an envelope and assumed those shouty two-letter state abbreviations were a modern invention courtesy of the U.S. Postal Service, congratulations. You've bought into yet another bureaucratic myth. Yes, the USPS did formalize the two-letter codes in 1963, with the introduction of zip codes to make sorting more efficient. But the practice of abbreviating states in all caps goes back further, and has more to do with typographic consistency and stylistic preferences than it does with mail carriers trying to save space. In fact, older documents and maps often featured capitalized abbreviations for states, regions, and territories. The all-caps aesthetic made things legible, uniform, and difficult to misinterpret, particularly on signs, forms, or typeset documents where fonts were limited and legibility was king. The Postal Service may have cemented the format, but they didn't invent it. So while the post office gets credit for streamlining our addresses, it didn't single-handedly decide that OACH would scream at you from every return label. And now, let's talk about another American political institution people think has always been around, the good old two-party system. Spoiler, it didn't come standard. The U.S. has always had a strong two-party system, Democrats versus Republicans, blue versus red, donkeys versus elephants. If you've spent even 5 minutes in American politics, you've probably assumed that this eternal battle of the two-party titans has always been part of the plan, like political gravity. But the idea that the U.S. has always had a strong, stable two-party system is yet another historical illusion, one that makes the early republic look way more organized than it ever was. In the beginning, the Founding Fathers didn't even want political parties. George Washington practically begged Americans not to form them, right before factions immediately started forming anyway. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans, not the same as today's Republicans, by the way, were the first to butt heads. But they weren't tidy parties in the modern sense. They were loose coalitions, more like squabbling book clubs with muskets. For decades, the party landscape was a mess. Parties rose and fell, Whigs, Know-Nothings, Free Soilers, each with their own moment in the political sun, before collapsing into history class footnotes. The current two-party structure didn't stabilize until well after the Civil War, and even then the platforms flipped, splintered, and realigned over time. So no, America didn't always run on two political rails. It stumbled into the system and has been duct taping it together ever since. And speaking of political misconceptions, let's take a pledge and examine who really penned those solemn words school children still mumble today. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a government official. It sounds right, doesn't it? A solemn pledge to the flag, written by a stern man in a suit inside a marble-columned office in Washington, D.C. Surely something so iconic, so recited, must have come from the government itself. Nope. Try a socialist minister. The Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy. Not a congressman, not a general, not even someone particularly fond of capitalism. Bellamy was a Christian socialist and a former Baptist minister who believed strongly in the unifying power of civic ritual. He penned the original pledge for a school program celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, awkward in hindsight, hoping to instill national pride and unity without invoking religion or politics. The original version didn't include "under God," by the way. That got tossed in during the Cold War, as we've covered, when religious patriotism became the government's favorite anti-communist flavor. So not only was the pledge not written by a government official, it was written by someone who probably wouldn't pass today's congressional sniff test for American values. And while we're talking about protests, pledges, and progress, let's break down one of the most persistent oversimplifications of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement achieved its goals solely through peaceful protest. Cue the black and white footage. MLK at the Lincoln Memorial, marches in Selma. Peaceful demonstrators linking arms while facing down snarling police dogs. It's the dominant image of the civil rights movement, and it's true, to a point. Peaceful protest was powerful, strategic, and essential. But it wasn't the only tool in the toolbox. What often gets left out of the tidy narrative is that the civil rights movement also included militancy, self-defense, and the quiet and not so quiet threat of unrest. Groups like the Black Panthers didn't show up to hold hands. They came armed, organized, and ready to patrol their neighborhoods against police brutality. Malcolm X didn't talk about dreaming. He talked about rights by any means necessary. There were riots, resistance, and rage. Much of it provoked by relentless injustice, and much of it crucial to pushing the government to act. Politicians often respond not to morality, but to pressure. And pressure came from multiple directions. Sit-ins and marches, yes, but also burning cities, rising tensions, and the undeniable realization that ignoring the movement could lead to revolution. So no, change didn't come solely through peaceful resistance. It came through a spectrum of tactics, some palatable, some not. And next, we'll check in on your wallet, specifically whether that cash inside is truly uncounterfeitable. Spoiler, not even close. U.S. currency is printed on special paper that cannot be counterfeited. There's something strangely comforting about holding a crisp $20 bill and thinking, wow, this thing is so sophisticated. No way anyone could fake it. The texture, the watermarks, the little holographic stripe. Surely this is money's version of Fort Knox. In fact, you might have heard the myth. U.S. currency is printed on some kind of top-secret, counterfeiter-proof paper that only a sacred government mill has access to. Well, sort of. But also, not really. Yes, U.S. currency is printed on a unique blend of 75% cotton and 25% linen, not the regular wood pulp paper you find in your average office printer. Yes, it has security features galore. Color-shifting ink, microprinting, embedded strips, hidden watermarks. But can it be counterfeited? Oh, absolutely. And it is. More often than you'd like to think. The U.S. Secret Service, which originally existed just to fight counterfeiting, still works tirelessly to track down sophisticated fakes. Technology has only made the job easier for counterfeiters. High-end printers, scanners, and image editing software mean even teenagers can cook up passable bills with enough time and YouTube tutorials. So no, your cash isn't uncopyable. It's just designed to make copying inconvenient. And as with most things in America, the system relies mostly on the honor code and panic when that fails. Speaking of intrusions and vulnerabilities, let's clear up the idea that the U.S. has always been an untouched fortress. The U.S. has never been invaded. If you've grown up watching American war movies, you might assume the U.S. is always the one doing the invading. Storming beaches, toppling dictators, flying the flag on foreign soil while triumphant music plays. And because of that cinematic dominance, Many Americans genuinely believe the country has never been invaded, never occupied, never had foreign troops marching through their neighborhoods. Total myth. Let's start with the War of 1812. British troops, not exactly tourists, stormed Washington, D.C. in 1814, burned the Capitol, torched the White House, and left with a pretty convincing mic drop. Then there's World War II, when Japanese forces occupied 2 of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Yes, actual American soil. Not to mention German U-boats off the East Coast, spying and sometimes shelling coastal targets. And if we widen the lens beyond military invasions, there are countless instances of foreign actors infiltrating systems, politics, and infrastructure. Cyber attacks, election meddling, propaganda campaigns. 21st century invasions might not involve boots on the ground, but they can still wreak havoc. So no, America isn't an inviolable castle protected by oceans and bald eagles. It's a country like any other, occasionally caught with its drawbridge down. Now let's talk about another national myth, that American governance is just a fancy extension of Sunday school. The U.S. is a Christian nation. Open any American history textbook printed before, say, 2005, and you might get the sense that the Constitution was written with a Bible in one hand and a quill in the other. Politicians love saying America was founded as a Christian nation, like that somehow makes it extra blessed, extra moral, and extra immune to criticism. But here's the thing. It's just not true. The U.S. Constitution doesn't mention Christianity. Not once. The First Amendment actually goes out of its way to separate religion and government. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's not a loophole. That's a firewall. Yes, many founding fathers were Christians of various stripes, but they were also deeply suspicious of religious authority. They had just watched Europe tear itself apart over church versus state, and they weren't keen to repeat the mess. Thomas Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state, and the Treaty of Tripoli, ratified in 1797, explicitly stated that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So no, America wasn't born out of Bible pages. It was born out of Enlightenment philosophy, legal pragmatism, and a general allergy to monarchy and papal meddling. Next, we'll crack the myth that the Founding Fathers were a bunch of ideological soulmates singing Kumbaya. Spoiler, they were more like a Thanksgiving dinner gone politically nuclear. The Founding Fathers were all unified in their vision for America. Imagine the Founding Fathers as a harmonious supergroup, like the Avengers, but with powdered wigs, working in perfect sync to build a shining new nation. They all wanted freedom, liberty, justice, and presumably some elegant cursive. At least that's the story we love to tell ourselves. But the truth? The founders were about as unified as a group text between rival philosophy majors with control issues. These men disagreed on everything, from the size and scope of government to how much power states should have, to whether the Constitution should even exist. Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government and a national bank. Thomas Jefferson wanted a weak federal system and a pastoral nation of virtuous farmers. James Madison flip-flopped so hard he could have been sponsored by Havaianas. John Adams distrusted democracy. George Mason refused to sign the Constitution over a lack of individual rights. Even the Bill of Rights was a compromise to appease factions who thought the Constitution looked suspiciously like a royal comeback tour. They weren't unified visionaries. They were brilliant, egotistical, and often hostile men trying to wrangle a workable government out of ideological chaos. And now, from ideological chaos to religious curiosity. Let's talk about that time Thomas Jefferson cracked open a Quran. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, third President of the United States, architect, philosopher, and apparently reader of the Quran? Yes, that Thomas Jefferson. The same man some today would paint as a poster child for Christian nationalism, had a copy of the Islamic holy book in his personal library. But before we start drafting wild conspiracy theories about secret conversions in Monticello, let's take a breath. Jefferson wasn't embracing Islam, he was studying it. Like many Enlightenment thinkers, Jefferson was obsessed with understanding the world's major religions, philosophies, and legal systems. His Quran was an English translation by George Sale, and it included lengthy footnotes about Islamic law, culture, and governance. Why did this matter? Because Jefferson and several other founders believed in religious freedom. Real religious freedom. The kind that requires understanding, not just tolerating other beliefs. He believed in liberty of conscience, even if that conscience bowed toward Mecca. The Quran in his library wasn't a scandal. It was a flex. A declaration that in America, no faith had a monopoly on moral truth or legal status. Which leads us perfectly to the next myth, the one where America's drug war was an actual war, and not just a decades-long exercise in disastrous policy cosplay. The U.S. won. The war on drugs. The war on drugs. Just saying it out loud feels like invoking a 1980s public service announcement. Cue the helicopters, the stern police officers, the frying egg in the pan. This is your brain on drugs. And of course, the belief that America decisively fought this noble war and emerged victorious, clean, and morally superior. Except, spoiler alert, we didn't win. We didn't even tie. The war on drugs was less a victory than a prolonged policy faceplant with generational consequences. What started as a political stunt in the Nixon era turned into a full-blown national crusade, ramped up under Reagan, and deeply embedded into every level of law enforcement, sentencing, and surveillance. But did it curb drug use? Not meaningfully. Did it dismantle drug trafficking? Only in brief, PR-friendly moments before another cartel or market took its place. What it did do, very effectively, was flood prisons, especially with black and brown men. It militarized local police. It criminalized addiction. It devastated communities, and it burned through billions in taxpayer dollars with all the efficiency of a soggy bonfire. So no, the war on drugs wasn't won. It was exported, racialized, corporatized, and then quietly buried under rising overdose stats and bipartisan regret. Next up, a myth with ego, nostalgia, and some very creative math. America as the oldest continuous democracy. The U.S. is the oldest continuous democracy. America loves to brag about being the world's oldest democracy, like it's some sort of founding father participation trophy that never expires. You'll hear it in speeches, textbooks, and the occasional patriotic bumper sticker, usually right before a politician suggests voter ID laws. The implication is that from 1776 onward, America has been a shining, unbroken beacon of democratic perfection. Except, once again, we've taken the truth out back, roughed it up a little, and dressed it in red, white, and blue. First of all, the U.S. wasn't a full democracy in 1776, or 1789, or even 1865. At its founding, voting was mostly reserved for white male property owners. Women couldn't vote. Black people were enslaved. Native Americans weren't citizens. The system excluded the vast majority of the population. So let's not get misty-eyed about ballot boxes. Secondly, other countries can claim older democratic traditions. Iceland's Alþingi and the Isle of Man's Tynwald have been around since before Columbus thought the Bahamas was Asia. Switzerland's direct democracy mechanisms beat the U.S. in terms of participation. And many nations have had continuous, evolving systems without, say, a full-blown civil war. So no, America isn't the oldest continuous democracy. It's more like the loudest guy at the reunion who keeps insisting he invented democracy because he read half of Common Sense once. Now let's saddle up for a different kind of endurance myth. The Pony Express, that legendary trailblazer that absolutely didn't deliver as promised. The Pony Express was a highly efficient and long-lasting postal service. Ah, the Pony Express. America's most romanticized mail carrier. Galloping hooves, dusty plains, courageous riders dodging arrows and bandits to deliver your 19th century newsletter about corn yields or someone's terrible new mustache. We picture it as a rugged, long-running institution that connected the Wild West with the civilized East, like some leather-bound Wi-Fi signal. But in reality, the Pony Express was more like a failed startup that burned fast, burned bright, and burned out in spectacular fashion. It lasted a grand total of 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861. 1 year and change. That's it. And during that time, it was constantly losing money, plagued by logistical nightmares, and completely made obsolete by, drumroll please, the telegraph. The minute wires started singing messages across the country faster than any horse could run, the Pony Express became yesterday's tech. Was it brave? Sure. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. But was it efficient or long-lasting? Not even close. It was a transitional gimmick in an era desperate for speed, but not yet ready for cables and Morse code. So no, the Pony Express wasn't the backbone of American communication. It was the beta test with a killer PR team. And now, from horses to something even less fun. Biological warfare. Yes, really. The U.S. never engaged in biological warfare. For a country that freaks out if someone sneezes in public without Purell, America sure loves to believe has never dabbled in the germ warfare game. After all, that's the kind of thing other countries do. Dictators, supervillains, Bond movie henchmen. Certainly not the United States of morally superior America. Except, yeah, we did that. During the Cold War, the U.S. ran a very real, very secretive, offensive biological weapons program. It began in earnest in the 1940s and ramped up in the 1950s and 60s, with facilities like Fort Detrick in Maryland churning out weaponized pathogens like anthrax, tularemia, and Q fever. They even ran open-air tests on American cities, just to see how far bacteria would travel. Spoiler, far enough to cause decades of lawsuits and conspiracy theories. And although Nixon officially ended the offensive program in 1969 and signed an international treaty banning biological warfare in 1972, the legacy is sticky. Defensive research continues. Stockpiles have existed. And the ethics? Let's just say it's not something you want to explain on a college tour. So no, the U.S. isn't biologically innocent. We played the game. We just called it research. And next up, we cracked the myth that the national debt is a modern invention, like avocado toast or political amnesia. The U.S. national debt is a recent phenomenon. The national debt, that terrifyingly large number politicians pretend to care about every 4 years. The myth? It's a recent problem. A modern mess, the unfortunate result of millennials buying too much oat milk and Congress funding too many bridges to nowhere. But in reality, the U.S. has been carrying debt longer than it's had a functioning Navy or a finalized Constitution. The first national debt came into being during the Revolutionary War. And not in a, we'll pay it off next month kind of way. More like, we're broke, let's borrow money from France and hope we don't lose kind of way. After the war, Alexander Hamilton, America's first Secretary of the Treasury and part-time Broadway superstar, made consolidating and managing that debt a foundational piece of the country's financial system. The U.S. has had debt ever since. It's ballooned during wars, recessions, pandemics, and every time someone proposes just one more tax cut without a spending plan. Even during economic booms, the debt didn't magically disappear. It's been refinanced, repackaged, politicized, and plastered on digital counters in Times Square. But new? Not even close. And speaking of things that didn't start when you think they did, let's talk about the American military's always there, always ready boogeyman, the standing army. The U.S. has always had a standing army. It's tempting to think of the U.S. military as a constant presence. tanks, troops, and global bases at the ready 24/7 since 1776. After all, this is the land of fireworks, fighter jets, and military parades every Memorial Day. So surely the United States has always had a standing army, right? Nope. In fact, the idea of a permanent army was terrifying to the Founding Fathers. Fresh off a war against a king whose red-coated troops were seen as agents of tyranny, early Americans were deeply suspicious of a centralized military. A standing army, they feared, could be used to oppress citizens, enforce dictatorship, or even collect taxes. The preferred solution? Militias, citizen soldiers. The kind of guys who kept their muskets in the barn and would show up when Paul Revere got dramatic. During peacetime, the U.S. military was often laughably small. At one point in the 1790s, the Army was so underfunded and undermanned, it couldn't defend its own forts from squirrels, let alone foreign threats. It wasn't until the 20th century, particularly World War II and the Cold War, that America embraced the idea of a large, permanent military force. So no, we didn't always have an ironclad war machine. For a while, it was more like duct tape and pitchforks. Now let's snack on a tastier myth, the idea that Americans are the undisputed champions of junk food consumption. Americans consume more junk food than any other nation. It's a stereotype as sticky as the bottom of a movie theater soda cup. Americans, waddling out of drive-thrus with bags of deep-fried regret, proudly leading the world in junk food consumption. Supersize it, add extra cheese, and chase it with a gallon of high-fructose corn syrup. It's practically a national pastime. But while Americans do love their processed treats, they're not alone, and they're not always number one. Countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, and even some parts of Latin America have caught up, or even surpassed, the U.S. in junk food consumption per capita. In fact, global fast food chains have made it their mission to export American-style convenience cuisine to every corner of the globe. Walk into a 7-Eleven in Tokyo or a KFC in Nigeria, and you'll see just how successfully that mission is going. Also, cultural eating habits have shifted in the U.S. over time. While ultra-processed foods are still a massive part of the diet, there's also been a rise in organic food, plant-based alternatives, and a growing obsession with quinoa. So while we're still in the top tier of snack-based sin, we're no longer alone on the junk food throne. Next, let's revisit one of America's favorite delusions: the idea that anyone can make it big in the land of opportunity. The U.S. is a land of unlimited opportunity where anyone can succeed. Ah yes, the American dream. That magical idea that no matter where you come from, if you just work hard enough, stay in school, and resist the temptation to sleep past 6 a.m., you too can become a millionaire astronaut with perfect teeth. It's the kind of myth that gets printed on motivational posters and cited at high school graduations by principals wearing polyester robes. But let's step outside the dream for a second and into the spreadsheet. Success in America is real. It happens. But it is not evenly distributed, and it's certainly not guaranteed. Socioeconomic mobility in the U.S., that is, your ability to move up the ladder from poverty to prosperity, is heavily influenced by where you're born, who your parents are, the color of your skin, your zip code, access to education, access to health care, and about a dozen other variables that have nothing to do with effort or talent. Studies have shown that the U.S. actually ranks below many developed nations in economic mobility. And the rags to riches story? Statistically rare. Most wealth is inherited. Most success is networked. And most bootstraps are actually just marketing. So no, America isn't a magical vending machine of success. It's a maze. And some people are handed a map, while others are handed a mop. Now let's turn to a monarchy myth, a tale we pretend we never had to live under royal rule. But spoiler, we absolutely did. The U.S. never had a king. It's a foundational flex of American identity. We don't do kings, no monarchs, no scepters, no thrones, just eagles, ballots, and the occasional reality TV star turned president. But here's the kicker. America absolutely did have a king. His name was George III, and we hated him so much, we launched a war over it. Before independence, the American colonies were just that, colonies. They belonged to Britain, and Britain was a monarchy, which meant that every freedom-loving colonist was technically a subject of the crown. They pledged allegiance to a sovereign ruler and paid taxes to fund royal wars they didn't vote for. Even after the Revolutionary War, the idea of a king still loomed large. Some political figures wanted a monarchy-light system, just without the powdered wigs and divine right nonsense. Hell, George Washington was so popular that people openly discussed whether he should become king. Thankfully, he declined, probably while frowning nobly in candlelight. So no, America wasn't born free of kings. It broke up with one, violently, and then spent the next 200 years making sure no president got too crown happy. Speaking of oversimplified historical turning points, let's talk about how the Great Depression actually ended. It wasn't just alphabet soup and fireside chats. The Great Depression ended due to New Deal policies alone. If you learned American history from a glossy textbook, you probably absorbed the tale like this. FDR rolled into office, slapped the Great Depression across the face with the New Deal, and boom, problem solved. Dust Bowl dried up, stock market rebounded, bread lines disappeared, and America marched confidently into prosperity. But the truth, as always, is messier and less flattering. The New Deal did a lot of good. It reformed banking, gave people jobs, built infrastructure, and instilled a sense of national morale when the country was psychologically shattered. But it didn't end the Great Depression. Not fully. Unemployment was still high in the late 1930s, and economic recovery remained sluggish. What actually yanked the U.S. out of its economic pit was something far more violent. World War II. War production created massive demand. Factories roared back to life. Men enlisted. Women entered the workforce. Rationing kicked in. And the economy was flooded with federal spending that dwarfed anything the New Deal attempted. Full employment came not from reform, but from rearmament. So no, FDR's alphabet agencies didn't single-handedly end the Depression. A global conflict did. And if that sounds morally complicated, congratulations, you're paying attention. Next, we turn to another myth of identity, that America has always preferred to mind its own business. The U.S. has always been an isolationist nation. The image of America as a reluctant global hermit, aloof, reserved, too dignified to meddle in other people's messes, is an enduring myth. We like to imagine ourselves as the wise, isolationist uncle at the international family reunion, nursing a drink and minding our own business until the fireworks start. But America's relationship with global involvement has always been more selectively extroverted. Yes, George Washington warned against entangling alliances in his farewell address. And yes, there were periods, especially between the world wars, when America dabbled in isolationist rhetoric, like a teenager trying on goth eyeliner. But from the moment it declared independence, the U.S. was not shy about projecting its power. Ask Haiti. Ask Mexico. Ask the Philippines. Trade, military interventions, political manipulations, all part of the early American playbook. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. was already eyeing Pacific dominance. By the early 20th, we were invading Cuba, annexing Hawaii, and helping redraw international borders. So no, the U.S. hasn't always been a bashful wallflower at the global dance. We've just been really good at pretending we don't like attention, while stealing the mic and rewriting the playlist. And speaking of historical inevitability, let's tackle the myth that America's global dominance was somehow written in the stars. America was always destined to be a superpower. There's a strangely religious undertone to this myth. The idea that America's rise was destiny, like it was baked into the soil, whispered by eagles, foretold by some divine constitution, carved in heavenly stone tablets. It makes for great movie trailers. But history doesn't work that way. Superpowers aren't chosen. They're made messily, chaotically, and usually at someone else's expense. At the dawn of the Republic, the U.S. was scrappy, poor, and sandwiched between hostile powers. Its first few decades were spent dodging wars it couldn't afford and praying the British, French, or Spanish wouldn't come back swinging. It took more than a century of westward expansion, read conquest, slavery-fueled economic growth, and industrialization before the U.S. could even flex on the world stage. What catapulted America to true superpower status was timing. Europe imploding in 2 world wars, oceans acting as natural shields, and a Cold War that split the globe into opposing camps, with the U.S. suddenly holding most of the cards. Destiny? Number? It was opportunism, violence, innovation, geography, and yes, luck. And on that note, let's round this myth marathon out with a fan favorite. The totally believable idea that the U.S. never meddles in other countries' governments. Buckle up. The U.S. has never been involved in regime change operations. There's nothing quite like hearing a U.S. official solemnly defend sovereignty and non-interference on the global stage while pretending there isn't a smoking briefcase full of coup blueprints under the podium. The myth that the U.S. has never dabbled in regime change is both hilarious and horrifying. Mostly horrifying. Let's start with the basics. Iran, 1953. The CIA helps orchestrate a coup against a democratically elected prime minister because oil and Cold War paranoia. Guatemala, 1954. Same script, different region. Chile, 1973. That one came with a side of political assassinations. Vietnam, Congo, Iraq. The list reads like a travel itinerary from the Department of Destabilization. Sometimes regime change was covert, whispered in back rooms and executed through proxies. Other times, it was loud and proud, full military invasions with patriotic theme music and a CNN banner. Either way, the objective was the same. Remove leaders the U.S. didn't like, replace them with friendlier alternatives, and then act shocked when it all went sideways. So no, the U.S. isn't a passive observer in global politics. It's more like the stage manager who keeps rewriting the play and then booing from the front row. And with that, our list of 99 wrong facts finally gets a truth injection. One sarcastic myth at a time.